Transformation Ground Control. Your source for all things business, technology, strategy, and change. If you're growing your business, leading change within your organization, or undertaking any sort of operational or technology change initiative, this podcast is for you. This show covers what you need to know about digital transformation, organizational change, operational improvement, and business growth.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 53. This is the podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation, including the people, process, technology, and strategy sides of change. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Kyler Cheatham. Kyler, welcome back to the show, as always.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. We've got a great show planned for you today. Before we get started, though, just a reminder, every Wednesday you can find new episodes on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter and Facebook. You can also find the audio versions of this podcast on all the audio podcast platforms like Apple, Amazon, Google, etc. So be sure to subscribe to us, check us out there. And just as a fun milestone before we get started, Kyler, this is episode number 53, which means we've done a full 52 episodes or a full year worth of content. So this is officially the start of our second full year of doing this podcast. So that's a pretty big milestone. So thank you for being a part of that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's been my absolute pleasure.
Yeah, so we'll see if we can continue to grow the audience, and even more reason for those of you listening to share this with others who may not be familiar with this podcast. We'd love to get the word out and love for you to share this content if you think it'd be helpful to anyone on your team or any of your peers in the industry. We've got a great show for you planned today. We're going to start off with some sort of hot topics and trends we're going to cover. We're going to cover a bunch of stuff in that segment. We'll cover a recent acquisition from Microsoft. We're going to talk about the Metaverse. We're going to talk about the transformation in McDonald's. So big brand, consumer brand, global name that will take some lessons from their transformation. We'll talk a little bit about digital transformation and modernization. And we'll also see if I can talk and spit out my words through this episode. It may be a very long episode based on how it's going so far, but we'll see. So that'll be the first segment, is the hot topics there. And then later in the show, we are going to have Marcus Harris on the show. And he's someone who's been on the show, I think, 2 or 3 times before. He's typically a keynote speaker at our Stratosphere event, which is a virtual event that we host each year. We're going to talk more about that event because that's coming up very soon, February 8th through 10th, stratosphere2022.com. I'll be there. Kyler will be there. Marcus will be there. A lot of other speakers will be there. You can register for free. It's a virtual event, 3-day event. You'll get the recordings after the fact. So be sure to go to stratosphere2022.com to register, learn more, see the agenda, all that good stuff. So back to my original point, though, Marcus Harris, who will be at Stratosphere 2022. He's going to be on the show, and he's an attorney that specializes in enterprise technology, software, and system integrator contracts and negotiations. He also does a lot with failures and lawsuits. So whenever there's lawsuits, he's oftentimes an attorney that gets hired to represent one of the two parties in a lawsuit. And in fact, that's how I know him, is he's actually a client of ours, and he actually hired me to be an expert witness for either 2 or 3 of his cases in the past, and that's how we've gotten to know each other over the years. So Marcus is going to be on the show, and we're going to talk about vendor contracts, the whole procurement process, some of the things you should be thinking about up front when you're first procuring software, and some of the contractual pitfalls and the legal pitfalls, as well as things that you need to be aware of as you continue beyond the contract phase into implementation. So really good to get his perspective. He's always a great person to have on the show because he doesn't speak like a normal attorney that's kind of up in the clouds, speaking a lot of legalese. He brings it down to earth to ways that I can understand, and most others I think can understand too. So he'll be a great person to have on the show. And then later in the show, in the third segment, we are going to have Adam Cheatham on the show. He and I co-presented a presentation on executive strategy and how executive strategy aligns or ties into digital transformation. So we're going to play you that clip later in the show as well. So be sure to stick around for the third segment as well. So all that being said, great show for you today. Let's start off with the hot topics, though. What have you got for us here? It sounds like you've got a lot of good stuff for us here today, Kyler.
Yeah, a lot of big movement on, Fortune 100 brands here. So I want to start with McDonald's as they are undergoing a digital transformation as we speak. And it's a very interesting transformation. I want to share a quote from their global CIO, Daniel Henry. It says, while unwavering strategic investments benefit IT greatly, it's culture that Henry views as the group's real differentiator. And I just want to kind of get your reaction to that, Eric, because when I read it, that's not typically what you hear our CIOs say, and really putting into, they call it a curious and creative culture at McDonald's. And that's how they feel as though they're going to be successful with this digital transformation. They don't even mention the software they're utilizing. Like we can guess, obviously, judging by their size. But I think that that's really interesting. And I wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I hadn't heard that quote. And in fact, I did not know that McDonald's was going through a digital transformation, although they're such a big company, they might always be going through transformations. But yeah, I think that's interesting. That is super fascinating, especially coming from a CIO. I've heard CEOs or CFOs occasionally say that sort of thing as part of their transformation, but hearing it from the CIO is refreshing in many ways. And especially in today's day and age, in that industry, especially where you have lower wage, high turnover types of jobs, where it's hard enough to get capital, human capital, to retain that human capital. Culture is going to be super critical for an organization like that, especially if you're going through a change. You've got to be very mindful of the culture. And it might be on one extreme or sort of an extreme example with McDonald's of why it's so important with lower wage, higher turnover types of employees. But any organization that's going through transformation should be thinking about culture if they're not already. So I'd say kudos to him for bringing that top of mind for other peers that may not be thinking that way in terms of culture.
Absolutely. They actually call it accelerating the arches, which I thought was pretty clever of a name of this kind of overall transformation program. And they really focus on not only culture, but attracting talent, which in my experience in working with kind of these low wage frontline workers, attrition is something that you just, it's the way of life. And that's just kind of how the life cycle of the employee goes. You might have them for 6 to 9 months and you kind of have this training program that you know how to cycle through the business a little bit more. Almost like that Jeff Bezos strategy that we talked about. That's kind of like they want their frontline workers to go do something else because that gets them through kind of the life cycle of the employee. And I just think that that's interesting because they're doing this future-proofing strategy that makes them the exact opposite of that. They're looking for, they say, smart people that love working with other smart people is their vision statement for that program. So I wondered if you could kind of give us your insight in working, with these bigger global businesses. Are you on side Bezos, Amazon, or are you on side McDonald's?
Oh, yeah. Gosh.
It's a hard one, right?
It is hard because I see the merits of both strategies, and I think they're both extremely not clever. Clever is not the right word, but just it can work really. I could see either strategy working very well. I'd say probably more on the McDonald's side. I mean, I don't know that I would necessarily, because if I remember correctly, isn't the Jeff Bezos model that you're just kind of assuming that you're going to have a certain amount of attrition and you're just going to make it the best experience possible until they leave? Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, so and this, we should be clear that when we talked about this in the last episode, this was pre-pandemic, before kind of the labor shortage. So I just want to make sure, anyone that's going to sound off in the comments, like we're not saying they do that anymore. That just was a model that's very polar opposite to this one. And they offered things like higher education or additional job training in other areas. If you work in the warehouse and you want to be a nurse, they will fund kind of part of that nursing training so that you can go out and do that. And they kind of bring in a new fresh workload, and they feel like that makes them most efficient as a business in that specific area, as opposed to McDonald's, which is really taking a top-down approach to not only their corporate culture, but also their frontline culture and trying to engage that, quote unquote, typical high attrition worker into kind of their overall cultural strategy and making them stay.
Yeah. So I'd say they're both, I'd say the commonality or the thing that I'd gravitate to is the fact that in both cases, they have deliberately focused on or defined or articulated a culture that they want to be that aligns with whatever their goals are. So I think that's more important than whether or not the Amazon answer or the McDonald's answer is the right one. As long as they're aligned, which it sounds like they both are, with their higher level goals and objectives and strategies as an organization, I think that's more important than whether or not one model is better than the other. How's that for a consultant answer?
Yeah, right. That's very political. I was about to say. Absolutely. Definitely both interesting pieces, but I do think that McDonald's transformation will continue to learn more about that, because they really do focus on the core customer experience, developing their human capital management through talent acquisition and retention, and then also on data-driven outcomes, which has been three of the main trends that we've covered on this podcast for 2022. So it will be an interesting case study to continue to follow their progress and what we can garner as best practices from them.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. I'd love to hear more about it too as it evolves.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll have to get a cheeseburger, as my son says, every time we pass that next time, and some fries, and really dig into it.
Right. See what this transformation is really all about.
Right. Absolutely. So speaking of big tech, Microsoft recently acquired Activision, which is a gaming company. So things like Call of Duty, World of Warcraft, and that acquisition was a huge price tag at $69 billion. And that when Microsoft, just to put it in perspective, acquired LinkedIn, they paid $26 billion. So to just kind of put that in perspective, I thought that was an interesting, just overall how big of an acquisition this is. And many people speculate it's because they're working to develop the Metaverse, which we've talked about kind of conceptually, because nobody really understands what that is on this podcast. We've also seen Facebook change its name to Meta and kind of going towards that. And the argument of big speculation is that really the Metaverse right now kind of has an established model of virtual reality in the gaming world. So take Fortnite, for example. You can go out and create your avatar. You can buy your avatar clothes. There is a total e-commerce model kind of living within the metaverse. And we've seen big tech buy up these companies. And the thought here is they're going to actually establish what the metaverse becomes because of their overall capital investment in that. And since you obviously know what can happen when big companies or big tech kind of put their hands in emerging technologies and what can come from that, I wondered if you could kind of give us your feedback in this is an emerging technology that was kind of in the gaming world and is coming more mainstream, specifically because of COVID-19 and people not being able to physically go places. What are some of the risks of big tech kind of owning this space?
Well, I think a couple things. Before I answer that, though, I have to get this out. So, and it kind of connects the dots back to the McDonald's versus Amazon cultural question. I had forgotten that Microsoft recently bought Activision. I remember reading it, but I forgot until you brought it up just now. But one of the things that strikes me as speaking of culture is, from what I understand and just what I've read in the news, I think Activision has a lot of cultural issues. I think they've had a lot of management turnover due to sexual harassment claims, if I remember correctly. I think there's some sort of controversy at Activision, and I'm pretty sure it's related to sexual harassment. But the reason I bring that up is not to bash Activision by any means, but just to go back to a data point I think we've talked about in this show in the past, which is that 80% or more of mergers and acquisitions fail. And the number one reason why is because of cultural misalignment. So I do question, it's kind of a red flag to me. Is that a good cultural fit between Microsoft and Activision? Is Activision too much of a mess culturally to integrate with Microsoft? Or maybe Microsoft's just so big that they can kind of swallow it up and change that culture that they have. But back to your original question, I think that, I think there's risk when you have a relatively small group of companies like Microsoft and Facebook and others that are creating and sort of owning and dominating a certain new emerging technology. And it sort of limits the participation or the alternate voices or the diversity of voices in the world that could contribute to that. Now, it's not to say that they won't eventually open it up and it won't eventually become sort of more of a democracy or whatever you want to call it. But I think there's always a risk anytime you have such a heavy concentration with really big companies owning and managing and controlling and creating something like the metaverse. So what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, definitely. And just to clarify, so it was the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing that actually sued Activision Blizzard for constant sexual harassment. So you're right about that. And they reached an $18 million settlement, which is huge, right? And they actually exited 40 of their leadership teams. So that's kind of just the background there. And I think we've seen I think the thing that I think is just the overall controllables on the consumer side and our understanding. We're about to talk about modernization, but it seems as though tech has accelerated our ability from a social standpoint to understand the impact of that acceleration. So, for example, the United States election in 2016, arguably that we had some Russian interference when it came to Facebook ads, and those were pumping and essentially affecting people's perception of who to vote for. And we really haven't been able to get to the bottom of that, just like other worldly cyber attacks that we really haven't understood. So I think the thing that's hard about that is these big machines are going into this to look to make money and almost manipulate the average consumer. So I think we just have to figure out, one, how do we legislate it, right? Like, is Facebook responsible for all of the things that they send our young people when it comes to mental health, or is that freedom of speech, specifically in the US? We know, like, Germany, for example, has put legislation in their overall culture to say you cannot do that, or you cannot offer all of these different ads to our consumers. But many countries around the world, especially large ones, have a hard time understanding what that impact should be. So I think things like the metaverse or these emerging technologies, we're really going to have to figure out what is their impact on human behavior, especially when we know they're being run by big businesses.
Yeah, that's well put, and I think that it'll probably be one of those things that governments throughout the world end up regulating or legislating in some way. So it's a good point.
Yeah, and I think that's a good kind of why digital transformation is critical to accelerating modernization. Excuse me, I'm like, your word jumbling is contagious.
It's totally
Right. Yeah, right. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about this with Marcus, is sometimes technology sprints and human nature is still kind of strolling, if you will. But in this article specifically, and in the research I did, it kind of talked about the different bigger buckets in which we're looking at the modernization and the simulation of technology into everyday life. Like, so for example, one of these trends is changing consumer trends. Obviously, we know we're going to a more remote consumption model. And this one talks about smartphone saturation, which is more than 72.7% globally. That's what that looks like. And then 3/4 of Americans have a mobile device that they utilize to check their bank account. So 70% of millennials and then almost 90% of Gen Z utilize that as kind of their consumer behavior. So we talked a little bit about the forced transformation of banking specifically and having to modernize into kind of that more technological ecosystem, which now has gone from a nice to have feature to, in order to be competitive in the marketplace, you absolutely need to have that. And that leads to things like smart ATMs being hacked and spitting out money, in city streets. And so it's kind of one of those things, like, this technology is great, but are we, from a security and overall infrastructure standpoint, ready for it?
Interesting. Yeah, that's a great point. And we've talked about cybersecurity on the show quite a bit over the past year. And that does raise the question of how secure is that, and what can you do to tighten up that security? What do banking organizations need to do to tighten up the security? We talked about that, I think, a couple of episodes ago when we talked about banking in the cloud. So really good points.
Yeah, so I wonder how, you can answer this huge philosophical question for us, Eric, and just solve all of our problems. But
That's what the show's for.
yeah, right. How, from a business standpoint, can you make sure that technology is not completely overwhelming your business model and taking you in a different direction that say maybe you're not ready for things like AI, or maybe you don't have business processes that's going to make something like predictive analytics actually valuable for you. How do you stay grounded in an overall ecosystem where there's a bunch of emerging technologies kind of flying at you, or software vendors are saying like this is the latest and greatest? How do you stay grounded to your core business needs and values?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is to have a deliberate and objective understanding and a realistic understanding of your level of current technological maturity. So there's not, some companies are just more advanced than others as it relates to technology. Some are already on more modern ERP systems. And so making the leap to AI and machine learning and metaverse type stuff, not that that's really a business thing yet, but as it does become a business option, who knows? But, that's going to be more realistic for that kind of company versus a lot of clients we work with are still working off green screens, AS400 based homegrown green screen types of systems. And that company is going to have to take a much bigger leap if they're going to go look at AI and cloud and predictive analytics and all that kind of stuff. Not to say they can't do it, but it's higher risk. It's going to take longer. It's going to cost more. And, they may or may not be able to actually go through that transition. And in those cases, it may be perfectly fine to say, well, we're not going to do that. We're going to take more of an incremental approach to deploying new technologies until we get to a certain amount of maturity. Then we'll take that next level or take that next jump. So I think you just have to be deliberate about where you are as an organization, where you want to get to, and then ultimately, how does that affect your overall strategy and plan and the risk profile?
Absolutely. I think that is something that is so key to this conversation and a great theme for this podcast, because I know you sprinkle it in a little bit with Marcus, and then specifically in your executive summary with Adam, you talk about how important that is to really understand your strategy and stick to it. We can be flexible to an extent, but not in the fact that it's going to put our business at risk. So I have a burning question that I wanted to ask you while I was reading this, and just, from your overall being a thought leader in the industry, do you ever think that there's a part of our life that will not involve technology?
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe as a backlash to technology, I could see, for example, a few weeks ago, I forgot my phone. I was out and about and forgot my phone for several hours, and it was at first very stressful, but then it became the most glorious thing. I didn't have to worry about. I didn't have the anxiety of, did I miss a call? What am I missing at work on my emails? I just didn't have my phone. It was great. So I could see organizations or people, I should say, maybe having a backlash sort of reaction like that. But I don't know that there's any getting away from the fact that technology is just continuing to permeate further and further into our lives, whether we like it or not. So it's just a matter of setting those boundaries, which we struggle with as parents. I don't know about you and Adam, or you and your husband. But my wife and I struggle with the right balance with our kids. How much technology should they really be exposed to? And I don't have a good answer for that. And I don't have a good answer for that for myself either, for other adults in the world.
No, definitely. I love unplugged time. I just, I have this crazy boss that's just all over me all the time. And, repeat calls.
You're sending emails late at night and stuff like that.
Yeah. No, yeah. I'm totally joking. But
okay,
I just thought it was interesting, right? I thought it was interesting because this modernization article talked about the pandemic and the different industries that have been affected by that. Obviously, we talk about supply chain. That's been one of the main topics that we've gone over, and something we'll talk about: digital stratosphere, labor shortage. And we've seen the automation and kind of the futuristic view of how you take away frontline labor or optimize it so that not only it's less human contact, but also more efficient in the way that you operate as a frontline workforce. And the last trend they focused on was childcare. And that's the one that I just don't know. Like, would I love a robot to make dinner for my family and, it all be like a smart kitchen type of thing? Absolutely. But I don't know how technology would ever solve maybe a childcare saturation issue, and where we have literal people that cannot go to their job because of childcare challenges. So that was the one that kind of struck me as like, I could see it kind of trickling into every other piece of our life, but I don't know if I could see it with that.
Yeah, I don't know why I just thought of this, but as you were saying that, it reminded me of I don't know if you did. You ever see the movie Rocky Four, the one where he fights the Russian? Oh, you're too young. You millennials these days. You don't know the good movies when they the classic good movies.
Did you say Rocky 4? Is there 4 versions of Rocky? Like, is
Oh,
there?
oh gosh, wait. How much time do we have on this podcast? Yeah. There's a lot. There's more than 4 Rockies. There's actually like 5 or 6. And
Wow.
then there's a whole spin-off with Creed, which is
I knew that part. I just
Apollo
did
Creed.
not know we got to Rocky 4.
Oh, it's arguably the best one. It's the one where
Okay.
so just a quick overview. It's set. It's the 4th one, so this is probably the mid '80s, maybe the late '80s. It came out, and robots were just sort of like becoming a real thing, but at a very rudimentary level. But in Rocky 4, this is the one where he goes and for those that have seen the Rocky series, it's the one where he has to go to Russia to fight this big huge Russian dude on steroids on Christmas Day. And so Rocky has to go to Russia and train in the snow with carrying rocks and stuff. Anyway, I digress. But the whole reason I brought it up is because in the movie, he's by this point in Rocky 4, he's been a world champion and he's made a lot of money and he lives in a big house and he buys his son a robot, and the robot like brings drinks. I think in the show, like you could say, bring me a beer or whatever his uncle said, bring me a beer. And the robot stumbles around and drops the beer and stuff. So it reminds me of how, yeah, you could get a robot to do childcare or cooking or something like that, but it's probably going to be pretty messy to start. And there's going to be a lot of testing that's going to need to happen to make that feasible. So anyway,
Absolutely.
how we went from what you were talking about to Rocky 4 back, I'm not sure, but that's the way my brain's working here today.
Yeah, well, my 1-year-old can get any video from my phone onto the TV, and I literally have no idea how she does that. And I'm like, I work for a tech business, and I cannot figure out every single time how she does it. And I'm sure, someone can tell me how that works and that type of thing. But I think we have a very technology saturated generation. Obviously, we know that. There's just some pieces that I'm like, you could talk about the basic needs of life, shelter. We now can buy a home from our computer. We have an algorithm that feeds us all of these homes that we'd like or showcases areas in which we should live. And for food, we can have groceries delivered to our door, no problem, through technology platforms. But when it comes to safety, that can go a variety of different ways. But when you talk about, that nuclear family safety, you wonder, like, how can that be so vulnerable technology that it would be involved in something so, sacred as caring for children? But
Yeah.
there's a kind of an interesting piece of when we talk about modernization, is anything untouchable,
Yeah. What are our limitation, or not our limitations, but what are our
like
our borders?
boundaries.
Yeah, boundaries.
Yeah.
That's what I was looking for.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point, because there's certain things like that. It may be that we just need to lag a little bit in technology adoption, and that's okay.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, I think that's a good segue, as we got deep there for a minute, to Marcus to take us back to reality.
Yes.
And again, Marcus is such an excellent stakeholder, and Taft Law is a main sponsor, as they have been in years past, for our digital stratosphere event on February 8th through 10th, which the registration information is all in the description copy below. And then also you can go to stratosphere2022.com to register. Marcus will be a keynote there. So I think this is an excellent preview to some of the stuff that we can talk about. And so I would highly recommend taking a listen, because he does not sound like a lawyer, to your point. Like, if you met him on the street or heard his content anywhere else, you wouldn't think, oh, this is a lawyer. He definitely has such a great kind of bird's eye view insight into the overall digital transformation process. So I'm really excited to kind of unpack that with you after we hear from Marcus.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's an attorney that works for a law practice now, but he used to work as an attorney, the internal general counsel for two different big ERP vendors. So he sort of knows how it works on the other side of the table. And now he's on, working for a law firm in private practice, helping clients with their negotiation process. And he also helps with failures and lawsuits when those arise as well. So he always has a good perspective, and he's a very, in my opinion, a very personable guy. And not that I don't want to say most attorneys aren't, but not all attorneys are fun to talk to, but he is. He's a really good guy, so I'm excited to have him on the show. We'll have Marcus Harris on. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control with Marcus and other guests, so stay tuned. So for all you listeners of Transformation Ground Control, I wanted to remind you of a premier annual event that we host every year. It's called Digital Stratosphere. It's a virtual conference that we've actually shifted to virtual since the pandemic. And we're having our next Digital Stratosphere conference online, virtually, February 8th through the 10th. So I encourage you to register for that. Myself and others from the Third Stage team will be hosting sessions, facilitating sessions about software selection, how to implement software, what some of the best practices are, change management, digital strategy, program management, all the stuff you need to know to make your digital transformation successful in 2022 and beyond. This event's for you. Registration's free. We encourage you and your teams to join. If you're not able to join us live, which we hope you will, but if you can't join us live, we'll also we'll make the recordings available to you. So be sure to register either way. Even if you can't join all of the sessions live, you'll at least get access to the library of recordings. So I encourage you to check that out. There's a link below in this podcast, wherever you're listening or watching. There's a link below to register. And you can also just go to our website at Third Stage, and it's spelled THIRD, stage-consulting.com. At the top of the page, you'll see an icon for registering for Digital Stratosphere. So be sure to check it out. Digital Stratosphere, February 8th through 10th. Hope to see you there. Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 53. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Kyler Cheatham, and you can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday on YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, among others. You can also find this podcast every Wednesday with new episodes on all the audio podcast platforms, too. So whether you're listening on Apple Music or Apple Podcasts, Google, Amazon, Spotify, wherever you're listening to podcasts, be sure to check out this podcast and subscribe to it, share it with others, and give us a review. We'd love to hear your feedback. I'm excited for our next guest, who's been on the show before, and I always learn something new every time he's here, and always enjoy talking to him. This is Marcus Harris, who is an attorney at Taft Law, which is a mid-size law firm here in the United States. And as I mentioned right before the break, this guest also used to work for software vendors. He used to be the internal general counsel for some of the larger software vendors, and so he's sort of seen both sides of the legal equation as it relates to digital transformations, enterprise technologies, and whatnot. So he always has a wealth of information to share with us. So with all that being said, Marcus, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks a lot for having me again, Eric. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm excited to share some of my knowledge from the legal side of these transactions with the audience today.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's kind of where we wanted to hone in here today, is sort of that upfront procurement and just the overall legal strategy, contract and legal strategies as it relates to not only procuring software and services up front, but also on an ongoing basis too. How do you manage to those contracts and mitigate risks, both from a legal and just more of a general implementation perspective? But before we jump into some of the questions I've got for you and whatever questions the audience has here, maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself. What have you done in your career, and where do you work? All that good stuff.
Yeah, I've got about 20 years of experience in this space. When I say this space, what I mean specifically is drafting and negotiating, litigating ERP-related contracts and projects. So, anything from software development agreements, MSAs, consulting agreements, statements of work, licenses, SaaS agreements, cybersecurity, DPAs, all of that kind of is in that bundle that it's all related to the implementation, design, integration of large software systems for larger enterprises. And really I focus on two areas. And the first one is, like I said, drafting and negotiating these types of agreements. So it's really getting in there with large clients, SAP, Infor, Oracle, going toe to toe in a drawn out negotiation process or a quick one. And then, God forbid this were to happen to any of the people listening today, but, a failed implementation project, taking that where it needs to be to get it resolved, whether that's mediation, arbitration, or, as you know, Eric, litigation, using all the skill sets that we have as lawyers to help our clients recover from the damages that they incur from a failed implementation project.
Sure. Yeah, and it's probably worth noting that's how you and I first met or know each other is from past litigation involving vendors and system integrators, where you've hired me to be an expert witness for those cases. That's sort of how you and I first met, is a client consultant relationship.
Yeah, that's exactly how it was, and it was an interesting case many years ago, and we continue to do that. Have interesting cases and tap you as necessary if there's an opportunity that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, hopefully the audience here today doesn't ever need you for those services, but certainly if they do have a failure, they know who to reach out to, and that you can help. But kind of moving to the front end here of transformation and sort of setting the tone for a transformation. I guess just to set the context for some of the questions I'll ask you is, it seems like there's so many decisions and criteria and parameters that get defined from a legal perspective, but also just from a pure delivery and execution perspective up front during this whole contract, vendor contract procurement process. But I think a lot of organizations don't really know what to look for, what the risks are, what the pitfalls are. But it's so important because you're sort of baking in what the project is going to be. You're setting the trajectory, you're setting parameters for yourselves, for your vendors, all that stuff. And so maybe just to start, if you could, before I jump into my real questions, is maybe just explain to the audience, if you don't mind, like why is this so important, this whole upfront piece of vendor contracts, procurement, all that stuff.
Yeah, well, I think you touched on it. Really what you're doing through the contract negotiation process and putting the contract in place is you're really setting the tone for how the relationship is going to fold out for the life cycle of the implementation project. So, and really beyond, right? So any kind of maintenance support, licensing, whatever it is, it's all going to be governed by the contract that you negotiate on the front end. The ideal scenario is to, have a contract that reasonably anticipates everything that can happen during that relationship and spells out a process for dealing with whatever issue happens to arise. That's a tall order, because I don't think anybody can look into a crystal ball and anticipate everything that's going to possibly happen in the future. But with experienced counsel, experienced consultants, people that have been through this a few times, you're going to set yourself up for a pretty good chance of success if you do the front end work by anticipating all the things where this thing can go sideways, have a contractual process for mitigating the likelihood it's going to happen at all, and when it does happen, know exactly what the process is to deal with it when it arises. My goal is not to, and this may sound surprising, it's not to put in place an ironclad contract. And there's one reason for that, really, is that I can do that all day, but no one's going to sign it, right? And especially not an experienced software vendor. Right. They're going to just walk away and say, your expectations are unreasonable. The goal is to put a contract in place that defines the relationship. It makes reasonable concessions on both sides. It doesn't shift the entirety of the risk of the transaction to one side or the other. It kind of balances it out in a reasonable way. And ultimately, you should be, as the business owner, the customer, in a position where something goes wrong. You pull that contract out from your desk drawer and you say, oh, look, on page 7, paragraph 3, we anticipated this would happen, and this is exactly what the vendor's supposed to do. And they're going to give you a hard time and say, no, we don't want to do that. That's not how things work. And you say, no, here's exactly what's going to happen. That's the goal. That's a successful contract process right there. That's the end result that you want to have, ideally.
It's kind of removing that ambiguity, making things predictable, having a clear, having those clear parameters or guardrails in place for the overall project.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. I mean, what you're doing during a contract negotiation, it's really not, from the legal perspective, it's not, I'm not concerned with the price, right? That's what people hire you for. That's what there's other consultants that can say, look, you're not getting a good deal. Attorneys aren't really focused on the financial aspects of the deal. I can kind of tell, just because I've done it a lot of times, if list price doesn't mean anything to me, right? It doesn't mean anything to anybody. You get an 80% discount off list rate, It's not because you negotiated something strongly. It's just list price is illusory. But it really is to put in place a contract that sets you up for success by governing the relationship, right? You never have as much leverage in that relationship as you do before you sign on the dotted line, and you've got to use that leverage in a way that makes sense for you. And really, it's all about risk mitigation. And you've got to ask the tough questions. You've got to make sure that everything is discussed prior to signing, so that you can see where how far apart you are. We talk about functionality gaps, but there's gaps in perception and gaps about expectations, and you want to minimize the likelihood of those coming to bite you in the rear end later. And the only way to do that is through a thorough negotiation process.
Right. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So when we think about, you've been doing this a long time and for decades now, and now we're in a new year. 2022 is upon us. A lot of organizations are sort of looking forward to, what are our contracts going to look like? How are we going to negotiate with our vendors? What vendors are we going to bring on board and whatnot? But what are some of the trends you're seeing in the market? What's changed from a contractual or procurement or negotiation perspective, or what is changing? What do you expect to change here in the new year or in the coming years?
One of the things that we continue to see as a focus of contracts is, this whole issue around data security, cybersecurity, data integrity, who's accessing your data. Do you need a DPA, a data processing agreement? And it depends. The compliance with, the new data privacy laws that have been put in place over the last 5 years or so, it's a patchwork quilt, of regulations and laws. I'm just trying to navigate that and figure out, what your issues are and what they aren't, and what your obligations are. It's incredibly challenging. I was on the phone yesterday with an NFL team that's entering into a large ERP transaction, and data privacy about with respect to the protection of the personally identifiable information of their fans was incredibly important. And it's trying to put standard DPAs in place with them, understanding what their risks are, how to mitigate those risks, and what the compliance framework is. What's actually applicable to them as a processor or a controller. So right. That's, I think, going to continue to be substantive over the next 12 months and beyond. So you've got to have strategies for understanding, how to mitigate those risks, what your obligations are, and what you can, reasonably hold your vendor's feet to the fire for. The other thing that we're seeing on a pretty consistent basis is vendor inflexibility with respect to negotiation. It just, you try negotiating with Oracle, and it's just, you're getting the stiff arm, every which way. It's just, there's not a lot of flexibility. And I think, it depends certainly on how much money you're spending, what kind of market you're in. I mean, if you're in a strategic market for them, you're a newer customer, they really want to get an inroad into the industry that you're in. Maybe you have more leverage, even though you're not spending as much money, but, always you're spending multi-millions of dollars, things get a lot easier as far as concessions. You're spending, under $1 million, good luck, right? You're not really going to get a lot of concessions for them. One of the other things we see with respect to Oracle in particular is really the push, and it's a continued push to try to finance these lower money deals. And that's almost always a mistake from a customer perspective, because you really take away a lot of flexibility if something goes wrong. If you finance the deal through Oracle's financing arm, and you want to hold back payments, you don't have the ability to do that necessarily, because there's an acceleration clause in those agreements where everything comes due at once, and they hold that over your head, and it becomes very challenging. Those are some of the trends that we're seeing. I mean, I think there's more granular things that we can talk about as far as specific techniques for negotiating, and indemnity and limitations of liability and super caps and that kind of thing. But from with a broad brush, that's really kind of where I see the market going, or where it has been and where it's going to continue to go.
So why do you think that is that some of the vendors are demonstrating this inflexibility? Is it because of cloud solutions, or more of a cookie cutter-ish sort of deployment or approach, or is it just that you've got bigger vendors now that are more active, or what do you think's driving that?
Well, I think it's kind of both. I mean, I think they're really incented to get these deals done quickly, right? And a long, drawn out negotiation process doesn't serve that need. They're really going into kind of the SMB space. You look at Oracle with NetSuite, those are smaller deals. And so their desire to negotiate a smaller deal is just gone. And the mantra that they keep repeating is, look, this is a cookie cutter cloud solution. everybody gets the same thing, and you don't need to negotiate it because everybody gets the same. Our business model doesn't really support kind of these one-off concessions, and that's not really true. Okay, first of all, everything's negotiable. It just depends, on what kind of leverage you have and how much they care about that customer relationship. But at the same time, it really is something that you've got to deal with, and you've got to have experienced attorneys on your side and experienced consultants that know, what's a reasonable ask right now in this environment. What can you get? What's important. You don't want to spend, time and money negotiating things, negotiating for contingencies that are very unlikely to happen, right? You want to get the most bang for your buck out of your contract negotiation with the goal of mitigating risk. And if you're only going to get 5 things, make them count, right?
Right.
So yeah, that's. But to answer your question specifically, because I'm not sure I have, is I think it's the size of the deals, right? It's this cookie cutter approach to these transactions, and it's leverage basically. If you don't have leverage, there's no incentive for them to make any kind of serious concession. Their excuse is, it's a cookie cutter transaction, it's a SaaS transaction, you're in the cloud, it's a single offering to all of our customer base, and there can't be any one-offs. That's the push, but a lot of that's not really true. So,
right. All right, thanks very much, Marcus. We're going to take a quick break and continue this conversation. When we come back, we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Relax, don't do it when you want to go to it. Relax, don't do it when you want to come. Relax.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 53. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Kyler. We're in the middle of an interview with Marcus Harris. As a reminder, be sure to check out new episodes of this show every Wednesday on YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, as well as any of the audio podcast platforms you listen to. Let's cut back to the conversation. Yeah, and just that's really interesting. And just a quick note for turning to the audience here. On the live stream, we've got people from all over the world. We've got just a few examples of people joining here from UK, Ukraine, El Salvador, Dubai, Kuwait, among others. So as we're talking here today, I'd be curious to hear from this global audience. Both Marcus and I are based in the United States, but I'd be curious to hear if some of these trends we're talking about are true in your regions, or if there's things that are unique that you're seeing in your region, or your part of the world, from a legal or contract or just a vendor behavior sort of perspective, because that's a lot of what we'll cover here today. So I guess one follow-up question there I'll ask then is related to the whole inflexibility thread is, are there certain vendors that you work with or that you negotiate on behalf of or interact with, or negotiate with, I should say? You don't negotiate on behalf of the vendors. Typically, usually it's the customers, I believe, that are hiring you. Is that correct?
It goes both ways, but yeah, It seems about 80% of our business is really focused on customers rather than vendors. Okay.
So when your customers are hiring you to help deal with these contracts, are there certain vendors, and you don't have to necessarily name vendors if you don't want to, specific ones, but are there certain ones that are easier to work with than others, or is it sort of kind of a universal issue that you see across the board with that inflexibility and some of the challenges you've pointed out?
It really is vendor specific. It's not kind of a one size fits all kind of situation. And I'm happy to name them because they frustrate me to no end, right? The most inflexible vendor that I've dealt with in the past 12 months is Microsoft. Okay, it was a large spend. Microsoft essentially told us to pound sand. We spent an inordinate amount of time going back and forth with them. In the end, we were only able to get very few concessions. A lot of time and a lot of money was essentially spent on that negotiation. In the end, they ran it up the flagpole multiple times and they just weren't willing to move. Again, it was a larger deal, but it was a larger deal kind of in the mid-market, and maybe that's the reason. So I'd say Microsoft is typically less willing to be flexible. Oracle is notoriously difficult. If you are spending a large amount of money with them, they're certainly going to come to the table. But if you're spending anything under $1 million, or even not much more than $1 million, I don't think you're going to have a lot of leverage and a lot of success getting a ton of concessions from them. SAP is generally willing to work with you. They're usually flexible. They're just kind of practical in the way they approach things. Their legal counsel is usually very reasonable. Infor is kind of in between. They're certainly not as bad as Microsoft and Oracle. They're not nearly as flexible as SAP is.
Right. So you mentioned that if you're not spending more than say $1 million on a deal, it's going to be hard to get a lot of attention from some of those vendors that you just mentioned. What about some of the smaller, industry niche or best of breed types of solutions that maybe aren't as big of vendors, but they're, so maybe, in other words, let me rephrase the question. Do you have, as a customer, do you have more leverage in negotiations with a smaller or mid-tier vendor versus one of the big ones, like you mentioned, like SAP, Oracle, Microsoft?
Well, I'll give you the classic lawyer answer, right? It depends. Okay.
Right.
It depends on the company. It depends on the niche. It depends on the type of solution that you're purchasing. So if it's a very narrow niche product, single sign-on security or something like that, you may not have that much leverage, and they might be really telling you the truth that you're spending $60,000 on this, and they're not gonna really move on concessions and negotiation. It just doesn't. It eats up into their profit margin too much. They don't want to spend months negotiating something that they're only going to get $100,000 on, right? But if it's maybe a third tier ERP vendor, they may be more willing, to negotiate with you, because the $1 million that you're spending with them means a lot more to them than it does to SAP, right? So you're a big fish in a small pond, and they're going to do everything they can to get your business. And sometimes you don't know until you kind of get into the negotiation which way it's going to go. But I'd say, kind of general, ERP providers are going to be more flexible than narrow niche providers. So, and the other thing to think about too is services, consulting agreements, MSAs, professional services agreements, whatever you want to call them. Those are always easier to negotiate than the software contracts themselves.
Interesting. Okay. Well, and speaking of that, speaking of SI or sort of non-software contracts, I want to pull a question from the audience, and it's a long question. The entirety of it doesn't show here, but this is from Gassan on LinkedIn, and he talks about it's a long question. Like I said, it's not mentioned here, but basically he's talking about how they reached he in a previous life or a previous negotiation reached a stalemate with an SI for which country will be used for arbitration. So it's a multinational deployment with an SI with multiple offices. This sounds like this organization had multiple offices. Is that something that when you think about like the venue of a contract or some of these multinational aspects of a contract, is that something you have experience with or have any thoughts on just in general, how to address some of those nuances of a multinational contract like this?
Yeah, it's a tough question because obviously there's a lot of fact-specific information associated with where you're going to want to arbitrate or mediate. Now, the location may not be as important as what law governs. Okay, and in fact, it's not. I mean, if you're in Kuwait versus Saudi Arabia, if you're kind of geographically close to each other, it's more inconvenient for you to travel outside your home country to another country. I mean, you're in, Colorado, I'm in Chicago, us having to travel to, Ottawa to for a mediation or an arbitration, that's not much different than, you traveling to New York City or something, arguably, right? Right. But, if it's Canadian law versus US law, that could have a substantive impact on how that the outcome of that dispute. So I think, you've really got to think about, what law you want to govern the dispute. And ideally it should be, in my view, from an American perspective, it should be, the law of your home country, ideally, you know, and the law where the services are being performed, that should be kind of what you're aiming for generally in most scenarios. Just because you're going to be more familiar with it, it's going to be easier to access attorneys that you know, or that you've got referrals to that are familiar with that type of law. You know, what you don't want to do is, we have a mediation or arbitration in Argentina, and now we're, scrambling to find, Argentinian counsel that's competent, and we've got to fly out there. We're now dealing with law that we're unfamiliar with. That could have serious ramifications. So, ideally, the venue is what we call it, should be where you're located, and ideally it should be your law. I mean, the worst thing that can happen is what we call in the legal world to get home courted, right? You're a foreign corporation, subject to dispute resolution in another country. Everybody there is, the same nationality. You're the odd man out, and now everybody, is glad handing each other and winking at each other, and you're the guy that's getting screwed because you're not from the same country. So those are kind of the practical considerations of it, without knowing the the intricacies of the legal aspects of the jurisdictions.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good point. And then a follow up to that, also from Ghassan on LinkedIn, is he was talking about with one ERP vendor he worked with, they couldn't make changes to their annual maintenance contract, and when they tried to change those clauses, the vendor said no. And I know this is something I've heard you speak about it at our events and other presentations I've seen you give. I've heard you talk about the the hyperlink that's embedded in a contract that they can change at will, however they see fit. And some of the difficulties negotiating, the maintenance or SLAs in general. What's your experience been along those lines, or what tips might you have for someone who's facing that same problem?
Yeah, I think you're in kind of an uphill battle situation. I mean, the problem is these contracts can be ever expanding, right? You've got a piece of paper that's usually some kind of PDF or a Word document, and then there's all these embedded links that then link to other documents. So the document you think that's 4 pages long is 150 pages long. That's just a nightmare for review and negotiation purposes. And I think the bright line there is really to be aware of and push back on their desire to be able to change agreed upon contractual terms at any point in your relationship with them. Now, because that's unreasonable. Okay, why have a contract, right? There's no reason to have a contract if one side can change it at will. Now, there's a reasonable aspect to this, and what they want to be able to do is change terms and conditions that govern the way you interact with the software to the extent that they've made substantive changes to it, 2, 3, 4 years down the line. Now, that's a reasonable concept, so they've got to have the flexibility to make changes to the software. And if those changes necessitate, a different way that you're going to interact with the software, they should have the ability to modify that. So that's kind of both sides of the coin there, and you've got to find a middle ground that's reasonable. But certainly, one side should not be able to make unilateral changes to a contract without the other side's approval.
Yeah. I find that fascinating that vendors, will pull that, or some of the stiff arming they'll do to try and push through their clauses or their terms or whatever. What about if we kind of flip the other side of the coin, or look to the other side of the spectrum here and look to your experience with organizations throughout the world that have reached some kind of failure. They're at a failure point and they've got some sort of legal dispute with their vendor or vendors. How much of that, in your experience, could have been negotiated better on the front end versus it's just something that the SI or the vendor went astray in their contracts? Well,
okay, so if your project's going to fail, it's probably not going to fail for a technology reason. Okay, now people are going to be taken aback when I say this, but most likely the software works. It works for somebody. Okay, and it works for any vendor is going to point to thousands of implementations around the world, and customers that are using their software successfully. So what that suggests then is that the software contract itself isn't the linchpin in the process. Okay, where the software is going to fail because something wasn't negotiated correctly in the software agreement. And when I say software agreement, I mean the license, the on-prem license, the SaaS agreement, whatever document it is that governs the software. That's not to say that there aren't provisions that are important in that agreement, because there absolutely are, right? I mean, you've got to know what you're licensing. You've got to know how much it costs. You've got to know what you can do with that software, what the parameters of use are. Can you have third parties access it? Can you have third party technology come in and hook into it? All of that stuff is incredibly important. But it doesn't necessarily mitigate the risk of a failure. Okay. Now, if the software was misrepresented and it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, that's a different story, right? That's fraud or negligent representation or something like that. Okay. That's a whole nother issue. But where the mitigation factor really is going to be in two documents, and they're arguably the same document. It's going to be in the MSA, right, the consulting agreement, the implementation agreement, and it's going to be in the statement of work. Okay, so you have to make sure that you account for the people process, right? It's not the technology process that you're contracting for. It's what is going to happen, right? What are the assumptions of the implementation? Who is responsible for the integration, the implementation, the configuration of the software? How are they responsible for it? When are things going to happen? And if they don't happen when they're supposed to happen, what is the consequence? What's the user acceptance testing criteria? What are the agreed upon specifications for pieces of functionality, modules, deliverables, whatever you want to call it? And what happens when there's a deviation from the specifications that were agreed upon? How many times do they resubmit it? What happens? They get let's say they get 3 bites at the apple, right? And it still doesn't work. What happens? What do you do as a customer? You get your money back, terminate the contract, sue them. I mean, get another vendor to come in. There's got to be a defined process. That to me is where, the real cost benefit is, right? You're spending a lot of money on a lawyer to negotiate your contract. And if you put it all into the software portion of it, you may not be getting a lot of value back. It's from a risk mitigation perspective. From a failure perspective, I mean, you've really got to, make sure that the assumptions and the expectations are all contractually defined in that services agreement, because that's where failures happen, right? You look at we can name, 10 failures that have happened over the last, 10 years. And why did they fail? Well, there were unreasonable expectations. There were, technology gaps, functionality gaps that weren't accounted for. There were things that were unexpected. And if you can think expansively, account for those in your services agreement, figure out how to mitigate them, then you're really giving yourself a dog in the fight, and you're going to do your best, to avoid a ERP implementation failure.
Right. All right. Thanks very much, Marcus. We're going to take a quick break and continue this conversation when we come back. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 53. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Kyler. We're in the middle of an interview with Marcus Harris. As a reminder, be sure to check out new episodes of this show every Wednesday on YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, as well as any of the audio podcast platforms you listen to. Let's cut back to the conversation. A question from the audience here from Malcolm on LinkedIn, and he asked the question of, do companies and boards put enough effort into understanding all the stuff you're talking about, the importance of contracts, the importance of, some of the different criteria we've talked about here today, as well as other criteria that you help clients negotiate. Do you think in general, companies and boards of those companies and the management teams, do they understand the importance of negotiating the best possible contract and the one that, represents your interests, not just the vendor's interests?
I have to say no, they don't. I mean, I want to say yes, but I think they pay lip service to it. They know they have to have a contract, okay? And here's why I say they pay lip service to it. You get a mid-sized company that is entering into a multi-million-dollar transaction for an ERP product, okay? And the first time they reach out to an attorney is a month before, the deadline for signing that contract. That's not nearly enough time. Just the turn cycle on a document can take a week, right? So you're putting all this pressure on that contract negotiation process and not giving the people enough time to do it properly and expecting, perfect results. It's just, at that point, you've got to pick and choose what's important, what's not important. You're giving up a whole bunch of leverage before you even start. So I think they understand that it's important, but I don't think they understand the process and what it really takes to do it right.
Right.
And, and one of the other things, too, that we see, you talk about trends, and I think this is probably happening because of vendors' positions with respect to the inflexibility and the non-negotiability of their contracts. People are wanting to know, well, what's market, and what are the minimal amount of things that we can do going into this contract, because we don't want to ruffle feathers and we don't want to ask for certain things. So they're less likely to negotiate on the front end anyway. And that's that's somewhat problematic. I mean, I think you've got to assess each situation. You've got to go through, list out all the problems with that contract, and then you've got to figure out what's important to you. You can't say, okay, well, we're only going to change 2 things because we know it's not negotiable. Well, okay, well, that's fine, but what about these other 3 things that are more important than that?
Right. Yeah, and it seems like that, if you're an executive and you don't do this often, most organizations, most executives don't negotiate often with software vendors. It seems like it can kind of get lost in the shuffle with, for example, if our organization was going to acquire a bunch of Office 365 licenses, they may not feel the need to negotiate that contract or the SLAs or the terms of that contract as aggressively as they might, some other large capital purchase. But when it comes to ERP or enterprise technology in general, that's quite a bit different, wouldn't you say? Then there's just more risk and there's more nuances of the contract that you need to really tighten up when you compare it to, say, a Office 365 license agreement. Would you agree with that, or is there?
Oh no, I agree with that 100%. I mean, they're not similar at all, right? I mean, the risk associated with Outlook and Microsoft Word for your organization, while they're important programs, it's not the spinal cord of your business, right? I mean, the risk profile associated with a failed implementation project, it's just enormous. I mean, if you flip that switch and the software doesn't work and you can't ship product, you can't invoice customers, you can't even communicate with your customers. I mean, the amount of damage that you can sustain as a company is just enormous, and that this goes to another issue that you haven't asked me about, but it's, if you're spending $3 million, $4 million, $5 million on an ERP system, you've got to make sure that you're spending enough money to negotiate that contract on the front end. I mean, that's not a situation where you want to say, okay, well, we've got enough resources to buy the software, but we really don't have enough resources to negotiate it properly. Let's spend $2,000, just get a high level review of the problem so we know what we're getting into. That might be the way you want to go, but that's not a good move. It's not a sound business decision, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you really want to, figure out how to mitigate the risk properly so that it matches what your risk tolerance is.
Yeah. Yeah. I think maybe organizations should think of this sort of contract negotiation less like an Office 365 or some, more simple, relatively simple IT contract, less like that, and maybe compare it more to what you might go through if you're negotiating a capital construction project of a new building. Hiring a contractor to build a building, or if you buy a bunch of equipment for your shop floor or a bunch of machinery, you're probably going to spend, intuitively, you need to spend time negotiating that. It's a big investment, so you want to make sure you get it right. You're reducing your risk, all that stuff. So I would see it more as like think of it more as one of those big, complex capital contracts that you might negotiate elsewhere. That's how you should be treating these sorts of contracts as well.
And I think that's a good way to look at it, because that's exactly what it is, right? I mean, you're investing in infrastructure to make you more profitable, to make you more efficient. And if you get it wrong, it's going to have far-reaching consequences, negative consequences for the business that are going to be potentially devastating. So it's a critically important contract to review. And the challenge that you've got is, I mean, we live in a world of click to accept agreements and apps and that kind of thing. And then when you've got a vendor that says, well, these are digital contracts, DocuSign, just go through it quickly, we'll get this done. That's what the salespeople are trained to do, and that's what they push you for. And you don't want to be one of those unsophisticated individuals that does that. Like I said, you're setting yourself up for failure and a rude awakening down the road if something goes wrong.
Yeah. Now, let's just say I'm an executive or a team member, and I get everything you're saying. I'm buying it. I'm buying what you're saying right now. But the vendor comes to me and says, hey, I've got this really sweet year-end deal or quarter-end or month-end or week-end deal. They always seem to have deals that are once in a lifetime that you've got to sign right now. But what do you do in those cases? Do you see that dynamic at play often, where it's sort of like, let's not focus on the attorney stuff that Marcus is talking about. Let's focus on the sweet deal I'm going to give you if you just sign this and agree to all these terms by the end of the week or the end of the month or whatever. Do you see that dynamic?
All the time. That's the most common dynamic there is, right? And what I've got to tell my clients is, look, we brought it up a little bit ago. It's okay. You're going to get this huge discount off the list price. It doesn't mean anything. Okay. If that discount's available on December 31st, there's going to be something similar that's going to be available, in January. It may not be the exact mix, but trust me when I tell you that if we properly negotiate this contract, we can lower your spend over the life cycle of that contract in a way that's going to get you more money, save you more resources over the life cycle over time than just on the front end, right? You can't get seduced by the front end discount, because it doesn't mean very much. I mean, if I can get you, caps on increases in future license spend, if I can get you, discounts on particular products that you might like, or we can narrow down the definition of, just as an example, of user types, right, or whatever the licensing metric is, so that it's not so broad that they can come back to you and say, oh, well, now you owe us so much money. How much money does that save you, right? Potentially a lot, and potentially a lot more than whatever sweetheart deal they're proposing to you now. So you got to look at it holistically, right? It's not just about a front end discount.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know if you have the same experience or not, but I have yet to see a vendor that I can recall that has pulled an offer off the table and not honored, sort of a year-end offer. So in other words, December 31st came and went. You hear this last year, they had this deal that ended at the end of the year. Come January 25th or whatever today is, they decide that, the customer decides, yeah, okay, I want to move forward now with that same deal. I've yet to see a vendor that says, no, actually, we're not going to honor that now. If you're ready to buy, chances are they're probably going to they're going to take you up on that, even if it was a limited time offer of sorts. Have you found that same experience, or have you seen otherwise?
I haven't seen the deal just totally disappear, okay, where they go back to, oh, well, now you got to renegotiate the whole thing. I haven't seen that happen. Now I've seen kind of a different mix, and maybe not as good of a deal. They couldn't get the same approvals because they're not incented, right? It's like, okay, well, I'm not going to go to President's Club now this year. I'm not making a big bonus, but right. But it's going to be equivalent, right? It may not be the exact thing. So I think the sense of loss or the sense of urgency that they set up, it's really not warranted. I had a deal a couple years ago. It was I won't tell you the vendor, but it was an end of year deal, and we stayed up until 11:30, and we got the deal done, but they couldn't get it signed on their end until the next morning. And so they told us that night, well, the deal's off the table. But of course, magically at noon the next day, the VP comes in and is like, no, we can still honor it. So, even when they say they can't, they still can.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Here's another audience question that's an interesting one, that is a really good question that I don't think I've ever asked you in all the times we've talked. But that is, how does the risk increase if you're dealing with more than one software vendor? And thank you, Malcolm, on LinkedIn for asking this question. But if you're dealing with, sort of a best of breed environment, or you've got, third-party bolt-ons or multiple systems that you're deploying as part of your transformation, and therefore you have multiple contracts, how does that risk increase, and how do you treat the negotiation process differently in those cases?
Well, I think the risk is increased dramatically, right? I mean, the more cooks in the kitchen you have, so to speak, the more problems you're going to have. We had a very large SAP failure a few years ago, multi-million-dollar failure. It actually put the company out of business. It was so bad. I mean, it was shockingly bad. One of the worst ones I've seen in my career. And they had probably 3 different vendors in there that were, doing bolt-ons, add-ons, niche players to the SAP system. And it was just a nightmare. So when it all hit the fan, where do the fingers point? They pointed at everybody, right? SAP points to this guy points to this guy. That's the problem that that you're dealing with. From a contract perspective, how do you mitigate that risk? I think, you've got to make sure that to the extent that a vendor is using subcontractors or third parties to provide services on its behalf to you, that there's contractual language in there that obligates that vendor to be responsible for any acts or omissions of those subs or third parties as if they were that vendor's own acts or omissions. So, the goal is, as we say, is to have one throat to choke, right? If you can do it. Now, it's not going to work in every scenario because it's just, it may not be a sub scenario, right? But I think you've got to think about the risk profile associated with bringing in multiple vendors versus using one vendor that has that same functionality. It may not be the top tier functionality. It may be a B piece of functionality versus this niche player that's got an A functionality. But think about the risk mitigation associated with it, right? You've got 7 vendors that come in. It becomes way more difficult. If you've got 2 or 3, it becomes easier. So I think you don't want to be short-sighted when you think about how hard it's going to be to manage this process.
In addition to having to think about all these different moving parts with multiple vendors, do you have, who's ultimately in charge contractually? I don't know if that question makes sense, but who's the, everyone's looking for that single throat to choke or that single hand to shake, depending on how you look at it. And when you've got a best of breed environment with 2, 3, 5, or however many software vendors, how do you create that accountability in a way that doesn't just lead to finger pointing later? So in other words, it wasn't my fault that this project went south. It's because of that other vendor that you're trying to integrate with. Their data didn't flow back to my system the way it should have, or whatever. There's a lot of finger pointing that would happen there, or that does happen there in those environments. Is there a way to negotiate around that, or to create parameters in the contractual and procurement phase that protects against that sort of thing?
Yeah, and there is, and really in the statement of work that's associated with the integration or the implementation of the products, you're going to want to lay out, who's actually responsible for, when these additional vendors come in, and who's going to ensure that, that piece of functionality is integrated properly, or that vendor is actually managed right. But you're going to have a push-pull kind of situation, because you as the customer, you're going to do everything you can to get your main vendor to be responsible for all these other vendors. And that vendor is naturally not going to want to be responsible for any acts or omissions of pure third parties that it's not even responsible for. So there's going to be a delicate dance in the way that you structure that contractual framework, but you've got to do it. You've got to figure out, how to give yourself the best opportunity to look to one vendor when everything goes sideways. And it's not an easy thing to do, but yeah, there are techniques, contractual techniques to try to do that.
Yeah, and it also seems like even in situations that it may be a bigger hidden risk, vendors don't have real strong HCM or warehouse management sorts of systems, so they'll bring on a partner that they partner with to integrate to a third-party solution. So you feel like you're getting it from one vendor, but in reality, oftentimes what ends up happening is then the finger pointing happens there. So in other words, it's not my fault, it's my partner's fault. And as a customer, you think, well, yeah, but I bought the software from you, expecting you to be able to handle that. Do you see that dynamic often?
Yeah, we see it all. It's pretty common, actually, right? When things start to go sideways, that's exactly what happens. And again, there are methodologies, contractual frameworks for dealing with that scenario, and in some ways, and some of them aren't even directly related to that particular issue. But it could be as simple as identifying all the third parties that are going to touch the software or have access to your proprietary information or confidential information, so that you at least know, right? You can have them sign some kind of acknowledgement that says they're going to be bound by the same terms and conditions. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to go about it. And it's really going to be dependent on the particular scenario and the particular engagement. But it's like you said, it's a hidden risk, and you've got to hire people that have been through this rodeo a few times in order to be able to parse that kind of thing out. Think about it expansively on the front end to mitigate the risk on the back end.
Right. All right. Thanks very much, Marcus. We're going to take a quick break and continue this conversation. When we come back, we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control. So for all you listeners of Transformation Ground Control, I wanted to remind you of a premier annual event that we host every year. It's called Digital Stratosphere. It's a virtual conference that we've actually shifted to virtual since the pandemic. And we're having our next Digital Stratosphere conference online, virtually, February 8th through the 10th. So I encourage you to register for that. Myself and others from the Third Stage team will be hosting sessions, facilitating sessions about software selection, how to implement software, what some of the best practices are, change management, digital strategy, program management, all the stuff you need to know to make your digital transformation successful in 2022 and beyond. This event's for you. Registration's free. We encourage you and your teams to join. If you're not able to join us live, which we hope you will, but if you can't join us live, we'll also we'll make the recordings available to you. So be sure to register either way. Even if you can't join all the sessions live, you'll at least get access to the library of recordings. So I encourage you to check that out. There's a link below in this podcast, wherever you're listening or watching. There's a link below to register. And you can also just go to our website at Third Stage, and it's spelled THIRD, stage-consulting.com. At the top of the page, you'll see an icon for registering for Digital Stratosphere. So be sure to check it out. Digital Stratosphere, February 8th through 10th. Hope to see you there.
Bad to the bone.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 53. My name is Eric Kimberling, here with Kyler. We're in the middle of an interview with Marcus Harris. As a reminder, be sure to check out new episodes of this show every Wednesday on YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, as well as any of the audio podcast platforms you listen to. Let's cut back to the conversation. From McDonald on LinkedIn says, great insights. Good to be here. Greetings. I think McDonald's been on our live streams before. I think he's somewhere in Africa. I forgot which country you're in, McDonald, but thank you for being here from Africa today. So another question I had for you here is, what are some of if we sort of shift gears away from procurement a little bit and just look to sort of the downstream impact of implementations, what do you see changing, if anything, here in the 2020s as far as implementation risk and things that, are things to be aware of or watch out for, potential blind spots, red flags that exist now or emerging or becoming a bigger deal now than perhaps 2 years ago or 5 years ago?
Well, I mean, you can't avoid, the whole COVID situation, right? And what it means to these implementations. I think the likelihood right now, certainly, that you're going to have teams on site doing integration, implementation, configuration of your system is pretty small. It's all going to be done remotely. And when that happens, there's a couple of things that you've got to be aware of. One is you want to make sure that you've got tight provisions that are governing the treatment of your intellectual property, your confidential information, your proprietary information, your personally identifiable information. Because if you've got 10 people that are all working remotely, coming in, burrowing in, accessing your stuff, you want to make sure that there's protocols in place for protecting it. So that's one issue. It's certainly different than I think a couple of years ago. And then the other issue is really, again, a people issue. How do you put in place the proper contractual provisions to manage an entirely remote staff, right? I mean, you've got to make sure that you've accounted for that you understand, what percentage of people are going to be accessing remotely, where they're going to be working from. I mean, is everybody going to be working from the Philippines? Are they going to have the right levels of experience? are you going to be able to replace consultants that are underperforming? All of those kinds of things become more of a management issue as everybody's working remotely, because it's different if they're there and you can see what they're doing, that's one thing, right? But if all these people are working from other countries and they're burrowing into your system, late at night, how do you have any kind of quality control over anything? So all of those become important.
Also, in addition to that, intellectual property, the security issues, there's also just the transparency into what your vendors are doing, not necessarily just from a security perspective, although that's obviously very important, but also from a cost visibility perspective and a project governance perspective. If you have a system integrator with a bunch of resources that you never see, they're never in your office, but they're off somewhere else billing by the hour and putting X number of man hours into the project, it's even harder now to look behind the curtain to see what exactly these people doing. Do I need all these people billing all this time to my project? It was already a problem before COVID, but now it's even more of a problem, I would say, in this post-COVID world with more remote workers. Would you agree with that, or have you seen that dynamic?
We see it all the time, and I mean, you've got to make sure that your steering committee meetings are happening, your weekly project status meetings, whatever, however often they're happening, are actually happening. People are attending those, that you've got your finger on the pulse of what's happening with your project. And one of the other things that we see, and this is in the litigation context, is we'll see regularly updated and provided project status updates, but a lot of times those are, I've used this word a few times today, illusory, right? I mean, they don't really provide any kind of meaningful information to you to make a decision as to what the real status of the project is. Everything's a green light, everything's great, and then all of a sudden everything turns into red, and you're like, well, what the hell happened here?
Yeah,
right?
How did that happen?
Exactly, and that's when all of the the fundamentals, right, become incredibly important. It's just basic project governance 101 has to come to the forefront in this type of environment. You can't leave anything to chance. And I've got clients, particularly in the litigation context, that say, hey, we want to have a hands-off approach. We're hiring experts so that they can come in and do what they need to do. We are not experts in software implementation or integration, project management. That's why we're hiring people to do it. And that's fine, but you've got the fox guarding the hen house, right? In that the vendors are incented by billing hours and making modifications and customizations to that system so that they can generate more revenue. And so your interests aren't aligned. And if you're not actively managing the project, you're really going to be in for a bad surprise at the end.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so even the best contracts with the best parameters and SLAs and terms and conditions, even though the best contracts, the best negotiated contracts still can't save you from poor project governance or lack of project controls and that sort of thing that oftentimes gets off track. It can help you. I suppose it can help establish some of those more formalized, documented controls, but it's not going to totally save you. You still have to manage the project the way you would, any other big project.
Right. I mean, we can put the obligations in the contract, but if no one's going to abide by the contract anyway, then we can't really it's not really going to be much help, right? I mean, you've got to have someone that's interested in living by that contract. If you put all the effort into developing a contractual framework that lays out all the things that you're supposed to do from a project governance standpoint, that's one thing. But if you don't follow them, then what was the point on the front end?
Right. Here's an interesting long question. I'm going to try and simplify it. In fact, I'm not even going to show it on the screen because it'll show. But this is from Gassan on LinkedIn as well, and it's a really good question. I'm just trying to think of how to paraphrase this, and I don't know if you can see it too, Marcus, but if you can, it might help to read it. But it's the one that starts with another lengthy question that came to mind. As there were deliverables and documentations during the ERP implementation that one could use for knowledge base to refer to in the event of a future dispute, I decided to video record all the training events by the ERP consultants during the design and training stages of the project. This was to be used for future training for new users and any super users who could use it for training material. And then a few years down the line, the company had some issues with the inventory module, reached out to the ERP vendor. They'd reconfigured the module and they had no other choice. He reviewed the recording and noticed that in the design stage, the ERP consultant made the recommendation to configure some parameters of the module. So he had proof of what was actually said or what was being done during that design phase. And I guess, maybe I'll broaden the question a little bit or the point a little bit to, everything from demos, so you're oftentimes demoed a vanilla off-the-shelf solution, but sometimes that required some special configuration or in some cases customization, or it's a different version of the software than what you're actually getting. So they might demo one product, but then the contract is for an older version or a different version, or doesn't match up to what you were shown. Do you have any recommendations like this, like recording demos, recording trainings, or anything like that to help just give you the documentation to kind of the paper trail or the thread, the breadcrumbs of how to connect those dots or those, expose some of those risks or challenges?
Yeah, the more information that you've got, and the more documentation that you have as to what was said during these meetings is going to serve you well later, right? Because you can't deny, the undeniable as a vendor, right? If my people came in and they said A, B, and C, and now I'm trying to say, well, they didn't say that,
right?
It becomes very difficult if there's proof, right? But I think you've got to be very careful in the way that you go about this, depending on the jurisdiction. I mean, some jurisdictions require, both parties to consent to recordings. Some jurisdictions don't. So you've got to know, what jurisdiction you're in, and you don't want to just, start recording phone calls without the consent of the other party to the extent it's required, because then, you're going to get yourself into trouble, right? And so you don't want to do that. But I think if you take a step away from those particulars, the fundamentals are get everything you can documented. You've got to know, you've got to have proof of what was said. And one of the problems that we run into, there's all types of evidence, right? There's testimony, there's documents, there's emails, text messages. But it becomes challenging when it's essentially a he said, she said kind of scenario where, I say, well, you demoed this to me and it wasn't what you sold me, but there's no proof of what was actually demoed. No real substantive proof. That becomes hard to prove in court, obviously. So I think, get everything documented as much as you can. You don't want to, be pessimistic and think that people are lying to you or actively trying to defraud you. But, these things happen, and, you might as well set yourself up for success if you're going to have a dispute.
Right. Now, what about, trying to decide, I have a few questions here. I'm trying to prioritize them. Speaking of prioritization, what about the vendor migration to the cloud? So, a lot of vendors are moving their products from on-premise to cloud solutions. A lot more customers are buying cloud solutions now than they were 5, 10, 20 years ago. What are some of the nuances or challenges unique to cloud deployments that people should be aware of?
Well, it's almost like this, unreasonable optimism with respect to the cloud is what I would call it. Okay. Just because something is in the cloud doesn't mean it's better than an on-prem solution. It just doesn't. Right? And point of fact, a lot of these cloud solutions that are being pushed on people today, they're not fully baked. They're not real cloud solutions. They're not built for the cloud from the ground up. They're just, old on-prem systems that have now been modified to work in the cloud. Those kinds of things are going to cause problems, and they're not going to work out very well. And it's hard to know as a customer what you're buying sometimes. But I think caveat emptor is really what should be governing your approach to these things as a customer. And you've got to be asking those questions during the sales process. Is this built for the cloud? How is it configured? Are you just taking something that was an on-prem solution, and modifying it to be a cloud solution? Just because something's in the cloud doesn't mean it's better in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, I think the constant drip of subscription fees and just other types of costs associated with that, can make it actually more expensive in the long run, much more expensive. So, if someone just, is trying to, as a general proposition, telling you, hey, this is a cheaper alternative, or it's a better alternative from a technological standpoint, that's not necessarily the truth. So, I personally don't see in the deals that we do that these cloud apps and cloud solutions are all that mature. Some of them are, but a lot of them aren't. I don't know what you see, Eric, in your situation. You probably see a lot more deals from a technology standpoint than I do. So you probably are, have some insight into that as well.
Yeah, I think it's that what you just said is true, especially for the larger vendors who spent billions of dollars in R&D on their on-premise solutions over decades, and now they're trying to move all that seemingly overnight. I'm exaggerating when I say overnight, obviously, but they're very quickly trying to move that all over to the cloud now to kind of beef up their cloud offerings. And there's just a lot of holes in those solutions, especially when you get outside of sort of the core basic ERP stuff like financials, inventory management. When you get outside that basic stuff into like PLM or manufacturing shop floor automation, all that kind of stuff, there's still a lot to be desired there for some of those bigger vendors. But you also have like the NetSuites of the world, Salesforce, Workday, some native cloud solutions that have been in cloud forever, and my comment that I just made doesn't apply to them necessarily because they've always been in the cloud. But it's more those legacy on-premise vendors that are now moving to the cloud. That's where you see more of that risk that you're talking about there.
Yeah. And you just reminded me something. Cloud solutions sometimes have kind of like this latency concept built into them, and not necessarily intentionally, obviously, but you want to make sure, because this has come up in litigation in the recent past with particular vendors, and I'm not going to say who because it's confidential, but we see substantive issues with certain vendors that their processing speeds in the cloud are almost not built for modern commercial needs. Something's taking 15 seconds to process. I mean, imagine that, right? If it's taking 7 seconds, that's cloud at its worst in some ways. So you've got to go into this with open eyes and ask the right questions on the front end, and really kind of separate the wheat from the chaff as far as what these salespeople are telling you.
Right. Yeah. All right. Thanks very much, Marcus. Thanks for being here again. Appreciate having you on the show. As always, you've shared a lot of really good information that'll be helpful, hopefully for our audience here, and also some topics or threads that Kyler and I want to pick up on and maybe dive into a little bit more. But before we do that, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us, or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 50. My name is Eric. I'm here with Kyler. We just had Marcus Harris on the show talking about legal stuff, vendor contracts, procurement. We even got into some implementation, project governance, and things of that nature that organizations need to think about as they try to mitigate risk in their transformation initiatives. What were some of your thoughts or takeaways from that conversation, Kyler?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to start by plugging those live streams. So if you haven't joined one, they are so fun because the entire audience members are asking questions, and we're doing some Q&A in real time. So they're at 10 o'clock Eastern time in the United States. So be sure to subscribe to Eric's channel because you can set a reminder, and they're just really interesting to listen to in real time. So just kind of starting with that overall insight on my side, because it was very, very interesting, especially from a legal standpoint, to listen to different challenges or experiences that our overall audience community has had. And a lot of my questions kind of stemmed from their questions today. So I want to start, Eric, in just talking about the challenges in flexibility from vendors that Marcus mentioned. And it was surprising to me in a variety of ways. So when you have no flexibility from those larger, bigger vendors, that you're if you're not the McDonald's of the conversation, and you may be still in the $1 million ballpark, but it seems as though they're kind of my way or the highway type of overall concept. And I wondered if you could kind of give us an insight as to why those bigger companies allow that. They're such forces, right, in the overall in their industry, and to kind of let a software vendor, even though they're big, kind of bully them into a different contract, I guess is just surprising to me. Like, why wouldn't they just go to one of the tier 2 vendors or pick a best of breed option where they can have what they actually want in negotiating contracts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that I have a good complete answer for you, other than, maybe share some pockets of where I think the dynamic comes from. I don't think it explains the whole picture, but part of it I think comes from, let's start on the high end of the market with the big, Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies, the big multi-billion-dollar companies like McDonald's or others that are going to spend a lot of money on a deployment. You would think that they have the leverage in the conversation, but the problem is they end up a lot of those bigger companies end up boxing themselves in and narrowing the competition, if you will, the competitive field down to, say, SAP and Oracle. For a lot of big companies that are looking for a new ERP or enterprise-wide technology, a lot of times it comes down to SAP and Oracle. So there's really, on one hand, there's a lot of competition in the enterprise technology space. But on the other hand, at the top end of the market, there's really not that much competition. So I think that's part of the dynamic you see there, is that SAP and Oracle now suddenly wield a lot of influence, or yield a lot of influence. Is that right? Yield or wield? I don't know. They exert a lot of influence on the software or on the customers. In the mid market, obviously the bigger vendors are going to have the more negotiating leverage. And then the problem is, if you're a mid-market company and you go downstream and look for a smaller vendor, maybe those vendors are too small. They might be more flexible and more willing to negotiate, but it could be that the product itself is not scalable or not, doesn't meet your needs. So I think that's part of the dynamic, is sort of the limited competition within each of the individual segments of the market. Overall, there's a ton of competition in the market, but once you start to get into specific parts of it, it seems like there's really not that much competition. And then the other dynamic at play that I think probably contributes to what you're talking about is the fact that all the vendors act consistently in that way. It's and I say all of them. I don't necessarily mean 100% of them, but a lot of them do. A majority, I would say, do. And they all sort of have the same mentality of, it's our way or the highway. Our technology rules. It's awesome. You really need this more than we need you. And it's for whatever reason, it's a mindset that a lot of customers just buy into. I'm not sure why, but they do. So anyway, that's part of why we always challenge the industry and try to call out some of the deficiencies in the industry, is because there's really not many voices of reason to kind of call out some of those behaviors.
Absolutely. And I feel, and maybe it's just my ignorance to other industries, but I feel like that's pretty unique to the software kind of playing field, is that you can have vendor partners that stand up and say, no, thank you. No, this is the way that we're going to do it. Do you feel like, in kind of the trends of some emerging tier 2 or tier 3 system integrators or vendor or software vendors, that there might be an opportunity to kind of challenge that overall mindset?
Yeah, I do. I think that you have some vendors that are trying to do that, and some that are doing it successfully. I don't think enough are doing it, but you're starting to see some. Like, one example that comes to mind is Odoo, or OpenERP, to the open source ERP software providers. They're sort of disrupting the model by saying, hey, we've got this software that we're just going to put out there for lower cost. We're not going to be as restrictive. We're going to let you try it for free. We're not going to have these contracts that lock you in long term and make it really hard to get out of our software. I mean, if you think about it, it's hard enough as it is to change enterprise technologies. There's no point in these software vendors being so overbearing about contractually locking you in and making it cost prohibitive longer term. There's a lot of that stuff that, again, they do it because they can. But I think there needs to be more software vendors like Odoo and OpenERP that step up and challenge that model, because I think there's a big market for that. I think that if you can build that trust and give customers, buying organizations, a better alternative that's either lower cost, more flexible, easier to deal with, I think you could slowly chip away significantly at the market share of some of these bigger software providers.
Absolutely. And that kind of brings me to my next question, is when you had that conversation about cybersecurity and data management and data security, Marcus had referenced an organization as big as the National Football League here in the United States that were struggling with that. I wondered if you could provide some insight, even if it's top line. Is cybersecurity something that is a contractual almost piece of accountability for software vendors, or is that really all on the enterprise?
That's a good question. I don't know for sure. I know that performance and uptime is oftentimes something that's included in a contract. But as far as security, like ensuring that data doesn't get breached or that the system itself doesn't get breached, I honestly don't know. I don't recall, and it's been a while since I've helped clients directly negotiate contracts. Our team does all the time, our team members. So that might be a good question for one of them when they're back on, one of our team members is back on the show. But I don't know, to be honest with you. I don't recall.
Yeah, definitely. I think it would be an interesting attachment, and it's easy for me to say, right? It's someone that's never been through that process. But if you do have kind of this cyber warfare, or this climate of cyber warfare, and a large enterprise is hacked, is there any sort of liability on the software company to help them kind of work through that, instead of, the US government saying, oh, do not pay the ransom? It's like, that's really easy for you to say, in the fact that you're not losing, hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue a day, because you can't do your overall day-to-day business, or complete transactions in any way.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a managed service cloud hosting provider of sorts, whether it's directly through your software vendor or if you've hired a third-party managed service provider that hosts your applications in the cloud and they provide all the infrastructure, then yes, you do have an answer. And that actually is one of the high value justifications for managed services in the cloud, is that now you have someone else who's responsible for that. And if there is a breach, that's on them to get out of that. Now, just to caveat that the I don't know answer I gave a moment ago, I was sort of answering it from the context of software vendors. So if a software vendor provides you a cloud solution, but you have, you're managing your own infrastructure and somehow you have a breach, I don't know how you contractually, or if you can contractually lock that in. But I think with managed service providers and cloud providers, you can do that, or that is common to have clauses or cybersecurity SLA, levels of performance that are expected for those types of organizations, or for those types of customers. So yeah, I'd say that, if you're running on-prem systems and you have a breach and someone hijacks your on-premise applications and you're managing the infrastructure, short of hiring someone else to come in and help clean it up and fix it, I don't know that you really have a whole lot of options, unfortunately. And that's why, a lot of organizations don't want to have to mess with that risk, and they want to move to cloud or managed services types of options.
So knowing that cybersecurity and data management is really something that has become the forefront in digital transformation, do you feel as though contractually there will be more kind of information or attachment to specifically software vendors, not so much the hosting, cloud hosting, those types of things, but is that something that will be kind of a main, even sales tactic for them moving forward?
Yeah, I think it already kind of is. They're using that as a sales message, as far as just the reliability and the security of their products and their offerings. There is some truth to that. I think where I get hung up, or where I push back with vendors, is when they say that cloud options are cheaper, because usually it's not cheaper. But there, as we've talked about so far in this discussion, there are other upsides, like tighter cybersecurity protocols and just someone else managing the infrastructure, or something you don't have to deal with. So I think that is a good sales and marketing message that you're already seeing come from a lot of those vendors.
Interesting. Well, that's something that I think is something that's kind of on the minds of many businesses, especially those that maybe can't afford a huge, data security or cybersecurity overall portfolio, because they may be a smaller business, but still obviously want to keep their data secure. So that's something that I'm excited to, one, at Digital Stratosphere asked Christy Barber and Amanda about in their mid-market and small business presentation, and then also Brad Feeks from Estes Group that will join us and talk about cloud ERP migration strategies. So those will be two good ones to talk about. One thing, I have two more questions, because I have so many questions when it comes to Marcus. So when it comes to contract timing best practices, we had a question from our audience about like, why do executives and specifically the board sometimes not understand or not be as engaged in the contracting process? And his answer was like, well, a lot of times they don't understand the timeline that's needed to actually engage legal counsel or support. So I wondered if you could give us kind of some timing best practices, or when you should know that you should engage either your general counsel or outside legal help within kind of your contracting process.
Well, I mean, my opinion is that it's such a big decision. It's a big spend. It's a big risk for a lot of organizations to go through a project like this, that in my opinion, most, if not all organizations should be enlisting the help of outside legal counsel, someone like a Marcus that specializes in these sorts of contracts, as well as your internal legal counsel, because obviously you're going to have certain terms and conditions that might be deal breakers for your organization or your legal strategy as an organization. But most internal legal counsels don't have a lot of experience negotiating these types of contracts in particular. And people like Marcus know what those pitfalls are. They know how the different vendors operate and where the gotchas are. So I think it's a pretty small investment for the value you get by having both, outside counsel like a Marcus Harris, as well as your internal legal counsel to sort of do that final walkthrough of general terms and conditions.
Yeah, that's a great point. Just having that overall industry insight is huge to that process. My last piece of commentary I wanted to just comment on or ask you about was the multi-vendor contracts. We kind of talked about the complexity around that. And I wondered if you could give us the third stage perspective on how you kind of advise clients through understanding just the different dynamics, not only contractually, but like just overall working with that many multi-vendor systems. And then also, is there ever a place in which vendors have the opportunity to kind of close the door on independent consultants through contracts with a specific business?
As far as independent consultants like third stage?
Yeah, because I know we have a great relationship with a lot of software vendors, but when you say, hey, I have this independent consultant that's going to help me through this, I assume they'd much rather just kind of use their own team and work directly with the client. And I wonder if there's ever a situation in which you've experienced a vendor trying to kind of pinch you out of the contracting experience, if you will.
No, I mean, we used to more than we do now. I think we're established enough now and people kind of know who we are and what our approach is, and they know that we're not a threat to them, the vendors. I mean, we may not be an ideal addition to their customers team because, now they've got someone else on the customer has someone else on their side helping negotiate contracts. So it's not that they're excited about it necessarily, but we work with these vendors so often across the world, throughout our 4 offices throughout the world, that they know who we are. They know that at the end of the day, the customer is going to be happier, more comfortable. And, after a while, they start to see that, hey, these guys really are independent. They really are just looking out for their customers' best interests. I think where we have a bigger challenge is with the system integrators, especially the bigger system integrators like the Deloittes, the Accentures, the KPMGs. Those view us as more of a threat because, they want to own the entire services relationship. They want to do everything, and including the things that they're not good at or including the things that they just don't do at all. They still want to keep others out from coming in to provide those services to their customers. So they too are starting to learn who we are and starting to, figure out how to coexist with us, as are we with them. But it's still, it's more of a challenge, and we're still trying to work through that as well.
Interesting. Well, such a great piece there with Marcus. And again, please join us on day 2 for Digital Stratosphere, where he talks about just all things in contracting and digital transformation. So there will be a live Q&A at that event. So I encourage you to bring your questions. I'll be in the background, as I always am, just hanging out, asking questions from our audience to Marcus. So a great opportunity to get some legal insight on your project.
Yeah, and I've yet to see Marcus get stumped with any sort of question.
Me too.
I mean, I was kind of trying today, in that discussion, as I was getting questions from the audience, I was trying to change the questions around and actually, a lot of the questions I asked him, I send most guests, I'll send them my questions in advance just so they're prepared. But with him, I gave him a list, but then I went totally off script and asked him a bunch of stuff that wasn't on my script. But I don't think I couldn't tell any difference in his response. So he's really good. So yeah, throw the questions at him and the other speakers, and learn as much as you can from that event. And if you happen to be listening to this podcast after the event already happened, because a lot of people listen to this weeks and months after they're published, you can still go to stratosphere2022.com, download all the recordings, and hear all the great content we have there. So good. Well, that's good stuff. We're going to shift gears, though, and go from legal strategy and contractual stuff, and now shift gears and talk about executive strategy and sort of overall digital transformation strategies, and how executives can define their strategy for their digital transformation. And what we're going to do after a quick break is we're going to come back and play you a clip from, was this a Stratosphere, a previous Stratosphere? Okay.
Yep, 2021. We did it last April in 2021, so still very relevant. We thought the world would be kind of back to normal at this point, but we can see that we're still kind of learning. And this is very timely. I feel like it gives a great snapshot of what the event's about, and giving real actionable tactics to how do you make sure that you do have this executive summary around digital transformation and understand what's needed to be successful.
Yeah. I remember giving this presentation with Adam, but I can never remember when or where or how we gave it. But it was a presentation that Adam Cheatham, who's our director of strategy and transformation in our U.S. office, and myself gave this presentation at Stratosphere 2021. So we're going to play you a little clip from that when we come back. But first, we'll take a quick break, and we'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Hello and welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 53. You can find new episodes every Wednesday on all the audio podcast platforms or wherever you're listening or watching to this episode here today. So be sure to subscribe to us. Be sure to leave us a review as well. We'd love to hear your feedback on this episode. I'm excited for our next clip that we're going to play. We're going to play a clip with Adam Cheatham, who's our director of strategy, or one of our directors of strategy and transformation within our U.S. office. And he and I, about a year ago at Digital Stratosphere in 2021, gave a presentation about executive strategy, digital transformation strategy, some of the things to be thinking about and how to define your digital strategy and roadmap. So we're going to play this clip, and then when we come back, we'll sort of unpack some of the concepts there. But let's go ahead and roll the clip right here from Stratosphere 2021 with Adam Cheatham and myself. This is a presentation that Adam and I often give to new clients and or executive teams at new clients, just to help them understand, if we have to give you a summary view of what it's going to take to be successful in a project and what it's going to take to navigate some of the pitfalls and avoid some of the failure points that Marcus talked about earlier today. What are those things? And really building on both what Marcus and Stuart talked about earlier, as well as what I talked about in the opening session. So we want to just provide an executive summary of transformation best practices. And Adam, chime in at any point, add color commentary, cut me off, and certainly anyone else who wants to jump in and interrupt with questions, or first of all, you're not interrupting, but hopefully you know what I mean. Just chime in with any chat questions you have in the chat box there, either on whatever platform you're watching this on. And I'm keeping an eye here on LinkedIn as well for anyone that might have comments on LinkedIn that's watching there. So the first thing to understand is diving a little bit deeper into understanding what is digital transformation. What is that overview of what digital transformation is? And we've talked a lot about this between Stuart's presentation and mine, just some of the emerging technologies, the different buzzwords and acronyms and types of technology that are being used in digital transformation. I guess the short summary, without rehashing everything that Stuart just talked about, there's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of technology emerging. There's a lot of options when it comes to digital transformation. Digital transformation can mean a lot of different things to different people and to different organizations. And it should mean different things to different organizations. It should align with what it is you're trying to accomplish. And that's one of the keys to keep in mind. And there is no one size fits all answer. There's no cookie cutter approach. There's no silver bullet. I mean, hopefully that's a theme that you're picking up on here with us and our technology agnostic view of the world, is that, what might work for one organization doesn't make sense for another organization, and vice versa. So we've got to figure out what the right path forward is for us as an organization. And one thing that is helpful, though, to understand, and again, there's no right or wrong answer here, is to understand, what is a true digital transformation versus a more of a traditional technology implementation. And in this slide here, we compare, call it your traditional ERP implementation that, would have been relevant 20 years ago, to maybe a more comprehensive, bigger picture view of digital transformation, which is what you see on the right. And again, even though I think the bias here is to assume that digital transformation is better than ERP implementation or traditional technology implementation, that may or may not be true. It really does just depend on what it is you're trying to accomplish. For a lot of organizations, doing a more incremental improvement or upgrade to their existing ERP system or their enterprise technologies can make a lot of sense, especially if what you've got is a pretty good starting point, especially if you're risk adverse, especially if you have other competing priorities that you don't want to throw in a big, massive transformation in the middle of. Then a more incremental ERP implementation can make a lot of sense. For other organizations, maybe on the other extreme, you're going to have more massive external impacts that might force you into a transformation. So, for example, you look at industries such as retail that's being disrupted significantly, or was already being disrupted significantly, and then COVID came along and disrupted it even more. And retail is a good example of an industry that, if they haven't digitally transformed yet, they're way behind, and they're being forced to in that space. And so, most organizations are going to be somewhere in the middle. They're going to be somewhere between, small incremental baby steps and big, massive transformation. Most organizations are going to be in the spectrum or the continuum, somewhere in the middle. So the key here is to understand, what is the difference between the two extremes, and most importantly is to really have clarity and definition of what exactly it is where we fall on the continuum. And that's really the key. Is if there's one takeaway I could leave you with on this slide, it's just be sure you understand what it is you're trying to accomplish. Are you trying to accomplish an incremental, call it traditional ERP technology upgrade or implementation? Or are you really trying to swing for the fences and really look for ways to improve your processes significantly, and to rethink your business model, and to standardize processes or to integrate processes? Whatever the goals and objectives are, those are all the things that you want to try to make sure you have alignment and clarity on. Now, when you look through each of the line items here, with the technology, the process management, change management, business value, all the row headings that you see on the left, you can see what the differences are between the two. And again, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just a matter of being clear about where it is you are, and making sure your team's clear about where it is you fall on this continuum, and then defining a path forward that aligns with that clarity. So I mentioned in the first presentation today that one of the biggest challenges, or one of the biggest root causes of failure, is lack of alignment and misalignment as an organization. And this is a good example of how teams oftentimes get really misaligned. They go in thinking that, for example, they'll go in thinking that, hey, we're going to do this big, massive digital transformation. We're going to implement enterprise-wide technology. We're going to rethink our business processes. We're going to reimagine the art of the possible, and all these, big buzzwords that industry analysts and us consultants like to throw out there. But then when they go to plan and execute, they treat it like an ERP implementation. They plan as though they're managing a more, traditional ERP upgrade. And that right there, you're starting out of the gates with misalignment, and you've got an unrealistic view of what the path forward really should be versus what it is. And you can see how quickly you get pretty tangled up, and your team's going to get tangled up, and it can be very difficult to to succeed in that kind of environment when you have those sort of headwinds working against you. So that's one of the big challenges that we see, in this. And so that's probably the big takeaway here, is just really understand what it is you're trying to accomplish between ERP implementation, digital transformation, or somewhere in between, and getting alignment on what that means to the overall transformation and the overall plan.
I think something that's important on that to note as well is that from an ERP implementation perspective, that's a bit more of a prescriptive technological solution, whereas the digital transformation is something that should be ongoing. You should always be transforming your business to remain at the forefront of your industry, and is a bit more driven towards what the organization and your business needs, as opposed to a specific solution that would solve a number of your potential digital transformation needs and goals, but shouldn't be the actual answer. So as an enabler, the ERP is the technology that enables a pretty significant chunk of your digital transformation, but isn't the actual transformation itself.
Yeah, great point. And that's an important takeaway there, is to ensure you've got that understanding going in here. All right, we're going to take a quick break and pick this up when we come back. But first, let's take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control. So for all you listeners of Transformation Ground Control, I wanted to remind you of a premier annual event that we host every year. It's called Digital Stratosphere. It's a virtual conference that we've actually shifted to virtual since the pandemic. And we're having our next Digital Stratosphere conference online, virtually, February 8th through the 10th. So I encourage you to register for that. Myself and others from the Third Stage team will be hosting sessions, facilitating sessions about software selection, how to implement software, what some of the best practices are, change management, digital strategy, program management, all the stuff you need to know to make your digital transformation successful in 2022 and beyond. This event's for you. Registration's free. We encourage you and your teams to join. If you're not able to join us live, which we hope you will, but if you can't join us live, we'll also we'll make the recordings available to you. So be sure to register either way. Even if you can't join all of the sessions live, you'll at least get access to the library of recordings. So I encourage you to check that out. There's a link below in this podcast, wherever you're listening or watching. There's a link below to register. And you can also just go to our website at Third Stage, and it's spelled THIRD, stage-consulting.com. At the top of the page, you'll see an icon for registering for Digital Stratosphere. So be sure to check it out. Digital Stratosphere, February 8th through 10th. Hope to see you there. Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Kyler Cheatham, and we're in the middle of a presentation clip that we're playing from Adam Cheatham and myself. So let's go ahead and jump back into the conversation. The other thing to think about too is what are those challenges of digital transformation? And this is actually a top 5 list based on our research and experience, and we published this in our 2021 digital transformation report, which you can download on our website. And something tells me that Kyler is probably going to put up a link in the chat box, like she has been throughout the whole session here today. So that we'll have a link there for you to potentially do that. But in that study, or in that paper that you'll see, the top challenges that organizations face, and this isn't just our opinion, this is what organizations state and what the project teams are saying are their challenges and issues they face. The number one challenge is change management and managing the people part of the equation. The second thing is misalignment with strategic objectives. And that's the key that we were just talking about on the previous slide, just making sure that there's a good deal of clarity on what those strategic objectives are and how this transformation lines up with that. And then number 3 is managing the system integrator and making sure that you don't view the system integrator as an end-all be-all, as a one-stop shop, because they really aren't. They may be a one-stop shop in terms of the technology work stream, but when you look at the business process and the organizational change work streams, that's typically areas that system integrators are not very well versed in. Or if they do have competencies in that area, it's very superficial and it's very much focused on the technology and how to use the technology versus how to transform the business and define business processes and that sort of thing. So that difficulty managing the system integrator is a big challenge. And then number 4 is clarity of business processes, making sure that you have clarity around what those business processes are going to be. And then 5th is difficulties with data migration. So those are really the top 5 challenges that organizations face. And I'm getting some comments here that the slide is blurry, and there is a lot of text here, a lot going on here. But hopefully you can at least read the bullet or the bolded areas. And if not, I've verbalized for you what those 5 things are. And again, we'll make sure you have a link, or you do have a link here in the chat box. If you want to download that report, you can actually see this exact graphic in that report. So if you want to check that, that's probably going to be easier for you to read or refer back to. And it actually goes into more detail on these 5 areas as well in that report. So if you're watching here on Crowdcast, just be sure you click that link to get the report. So one thing I'll note here is that none of these 5 things, except for maybe the 5th one, the data migration one, really have anything to do with the technology or the software itself. These are all issues related to business processes, organizational change, and I'd call it project governance as well. So just food for thought there as you think about where are you most likely going to run into trouble. I heard Marcus say, yeah, you sometimes do have issues with technology, and you can certainly find a way to mess that up if you start to customize software, if you don't really think things through or test the software. You can certainly run into issues there. But back to a point I made in the first session, it's usually fairly black and white or relatively black and white on the technology side. Either the technology works or it doesn't from a technical perspective. But the gray area comes down to, yes, it works technically, but does it work for our business, for our organization? And that gray area is where most organizations struggle, where most organizations don't spend enough time and money. And so it's really a matter of maybe shifting your mindset a little bit to focus more on those other areas. And then another challenge that we see is that in that same report, in that same link that you see that Kyla provided here, you can see that one of the biggest challenges that organizations face is this whole concept of operational disruption. So we spend so much time thinking about what is our cost of implementation? How long is it going to take? How much of people's time is it going to take? And we tend to try to optimize or minimize that amount of time or that amount of time and that overall cost without thinking about the longer term implications. Yes, we could certainly cut costs and reduce the implementation duration and reduce the amount of impact that this has to our resources during the implementation. We could always do that. But the question becomes, but what does that do longer term to our total cost of ownership, the total cost of the implementation, either because we had to fix things that went wrong in the implementation in the first time, or what's even more costly is when you have this operational disruption where, yep, we went live, but we couldn't ship product. We couldn't close the books. We couldn't invoice customers. We couldn't collect cash, whatever the problem statement is. A lot of organizations run into that sort of challenge. And in fact, in our research over the years, and this actually goes back over a decade, we've managed this, or we've measured this one metric of what is the operational disruption, and just over 50%, between 51 and 54%, it's always fallen in that range every year we conducted the study. Just over half experienced some sort of material operational disruption, not just your usual, it was a little bit harder than we thought, or it took us a little bit of time to get used to the new system. We're not talking about that. We're talking about we couldn't ship product. We couldn't close the books. There's some major disruption to our business, and half of organizations are facing that problem when they go live with new technology. And when you look at what the impact to the overall total cost is, or how much that operational disruption costs relative to the cost of the actual implementation itself, usually when there is that sort of operational disruption, those costs will dwarf the cost of the implementation itself. So, I think back to early in my career, one of the first projects that I had managed from soup to nuts, from selection all the way through implementation, was for a mid-sized manufacturer in the U.S., and they had European operations as well. So a multinational mid-sized organization, manufacturer of engineer to order or make to order types of products. They made pressure gauges and pressure gauges for like oil pipelines and gas pipelines and water mains and things like that. And they had implemented a manufacturing ERP solution. I remember that there was a couple decision points along the way where we had decided to, or we had recommended that they push out the go live because they had decided to do a bunch of customization to address some of the unique factors of their business, and that was pushing the timeline out. And I remember it was the second time the go live had been shifted. It had already been shifted 2 times, and we were recommending a third shift by 30 days to push it out 30 days to make sure we had time to finish the testing and to get through the wrinkles in the system that they were deploying. And the CEO, I still remember the CEO said, look, we've got to cut our losses. We've got to stop the bleeding. This is taking too long, taking too much time and money. We need to just go live. And, of course we recommended, okay, we don't recommend you do that. Here are the risks, just to make sure you're aware of the risks. And they said, okay, we get it, but we still want to go live. So long story short, we helped them through the go live, and it was a mess. They went live, and at the end of the day, they lost so many customer orders that they're about $100 million US company in annual revenue. They had lost, and when I say lost, I don't mean like it just took them a little bit longer to fill the order, or they had to delay these orders. They actually lost $10 million, over $10 million of orders in those first 2 to 3 months after go live. And so you look at the cost, take the profit margin on whatever that $10 million of sales was, call it, 1 or 2 million in lost profit. You compare that to what was going to be about, if I remember correctly, somewhere between $60,000 and $70,000 it would have cost to extend the go live, that extra 30 days to go through the diligence and the testing. So they made that trade-off, or that conscious decision, that we want to save that $60,000 or $70,000. So they did do that. They gained that $60,000 or $70,000, but they lost however many millions of dollars in profit on that. Lost $10 million in sales. So that's the way you kind of have to think about this. Is it's never an easy answer, and there's never a good answer when you get into those types of situations. But you do want to make sure you have a clear understanding of what the real impact is to the organization, and the real cost as well. And then, the variables that had the strongest impact on operational disruption, just in case you can't read the box on the right there, the biggest variables were clarity of business processes. Those that have tighter, better defined processes tended to have less operational disruption. Those that invested in change management tended to have less operational disruption. Those that had alignment among the executives and key stakeholders had less disruption, as did those that spent time and effort on the user acceptance testing and conference room pilots, and making sure they almost over invested in that process to make sure they worked out all the kinks and the wrinkles. And again, there's a big difference between the technology working and the system integrator delivering a working system from a technical perspective versus one that actually works for your business and it can actually function within your business. Those are 2 very different things oftentimes.
Yeah, and Eric, it looks like we have some questions specifically on budgeting for organizational change management. Can you talk about how you might do that within this process?
Sure. We get that question a lot, and that's a tough one to answer because I don't have a hard and fast metric. Typically, what we do is we'll go in and do an organizational assessment to figure out, what is the culture of the organization, how big is the change? Because obviously, if it's a bigger change, that's going to require more organizational change management. How quickly are you trying to make the change? How willing and able and skilled are your people in migrating to that change? Those are all things that affect the amount of time and money and effort it's going to take to invest in change management. But a good metric that I've used, and I think I've seen this from, I don't remember if it's Gartner or one of the big industry analyst firms. I thought I had seen in the past, and I've always had it in my mind for the last several years, it's somewhere between 15 and 20% of the total budget should be invested in change management. And what you find is it's usually a tiny fraction of that. I mean, oftentimes you're lucky to get a couple percentage points of a total budget on the overall implementation. But what I would say though, here's the other thing. You hear post-mortem, you often hear clients complain about, they spent too much time and money on the project. Oftentimes we spent too much time and money just trying to get the technology configured and customized and tested and all that stuff. But I've never heard a client say, yeah, we spent way too much money on change management. It's usually we should have spent more on that and less on the technology. So the more you can simplify some of the technology work streams and focus more on the human pieces, I'd I'd rather take a underwhelming technical solution, but have a really good change management solution. That's probably going to be a better bet than trying to swing for the fences on the technology side, but then under investing in the human side.
I would agree with that. The overall point here is to enable your business to function more effectively, and it's a far better scenario to implement bad software very well than it is to implement very good software poorly.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of what complicates that point, Adam, is that vendors and system integrators they're selling you on this vision of what their technology can do and how great the technology is. And back to Stuart's presentation and even mine at the very beginning of today, you kind of look long term what things could be like 10 years from now, and then you try to cram that all into a 12 or 18 month implementation. It's just not going to happen. So you've got to figure out how do we maybe back off those expectations and say, okay, that might be where we're going to be in 10 years, but in 2 years we might just be happy automating our, getting some real simple GL and accounting software in place. Maybe that's okay. Maybe that's a, good risk reward trade-off there.
Yeah. And we've got 2 questions about defining processes, judging whether or not processes are defined well enough, and then also with how important are edge cases in the process design. Those are kind of intertwined, I would say. And Eric, I'd be curious as to what your thoughts are here too. But from a perspective of defining your current state, before your implementations, not quite as necessary as the detail that you get into in defining your processes in the implementation. And every possible scenario should be accommodated in a system or known that it's not going to be in the system. From a you can call them edge cases, you can call them exceptions. Your ERP, you don't choose one and implement it for the happy path in your business processes. So having everything down to the nittiest grittiest detail is really important to being successful in your implementation on the whole, and not just creating it in that space, but also implementing it down to that and testing it down to that space with real data is really how you get to the point of the highest degree of success in your business processes and in going live and testing those edge cases with real data. Knowing where some of them are, you're always going to have unknown unknowns that come up throughout the process, but knowing that you're getting everything and getting coverage of the whole of your business is really critical to success, because it's very frequently the edge cases that cause the biggest breakages.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes those edge cases can bring the operations to its knees, or depending on what it is or how customer facing it is, of course. But that's a good point. And you're never going to cover every single exception or scenario. There's always curveballs that you get in your day-to-day operations. But if they're known curveballs or known exceptions or things that are difficult, or where you have some sort of unique workaround right now, I agree with you. That's what's going to mess things up or tangle things up when you get into a real world environment. And the question here about how do you know if the processes are defined enough? I think Liam asked that question around how do you know if they're defined enough? The way I always think about it is, I'm not sure if anyone on the conference here today is familiar with that level 1 through 5 methodology or nomenclature for business process definition. But to simplify it, it's level 1 is sort of your macro process at a real high level. Level 5 is getting down to the real granular keystroke transactional workflows, and then levels 2 through 4 kind of incrementally working their way down to level 5 level of detail. But when you're evaluating technology, usually you're kind of at that level 1 and 2. You're up at the macro level. You're defining your business processes in a way that's helping you evaluate and choose the right technology that's the best fit. You don't want to get down to level 3, 4, 5 because that's dependent on what technology you deploy. But when you've selected the software and then you start moving into implementation, what ends up happening is the system integrator generally wants to dive straight down into level 5. So they're just trying to figure out, okay, how do I build these workflows in the system and start training people on the workflows? But then you miss that middle part. So usually when we do the implementation readiness or that pre-implementation planning, we suggest getting a little bit deeper, maybe down to level 2 and 3 level of granularity, just so you have a pretty clear blueprint of how you want the technology to be deployed. And then you have better direction to give to your system integrator on, kind of here's our roadmap or here's our blueprint for what we want. Now let's fill in the blanks of how the technology is going to fit within that. And let's reconcile where maybe the technology can't support that. But at least then you have a clear blueprint for where you want to go. So I think that's an important step that gets missed more often than not. And that creates a level of misalignment too, because if your transactional workflows down here are working, but they're not aligned with those high level macro business processes, you need to connect those dots and get them aligned in the middle there. Those are good questions. All right, we're going to take a quick break and pick this up when we come back. But first, let's take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Kyler Cheatham, and we're in the middle of a presentation clip that we're playing from Adam Cheatham and myself. So let's go ahead and jump back into the conversation. So with that being said, let's dive into what are those keys to transformation success. And there's actually 8 of them that we'll cover. And these are the sort of the high level themes that you may have picked up on, or we may have alluded to throughout other presentations. And some of this may be new. But the first thing to keep in mind, or the first tip, if we're to summarize 8 things for sort of an executive level executive summary, is that first of all, failure can be avoided. Even though the statistics are pretty dismal, even though a lot of research shows that upwards of 80% of transformations fail. I just shared with you the statistic that over half of implementations suffer from some sort of material operational disruption. It may sound like it's sort of a lost cause. It's just we're doomed for failure. We're doomed for all this pain. And the reality is it's not true. I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise to most organizations that go through failure, but it ends up being a surprise because they're not well educated. They've been misled by their system integrator or their vendor, or they just don't know any better. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why they're surprised by it, but they shouldn't be. If they just educate themselves and understand lessons from others and understand what some of the key themes for success are, then they will succeed. And usually you can tell by looking at a number of different criteria. You can sort of tell whether or not a project's going to be a success or failure. Now, granted, not to say that there's situations where there's never challenges. Every project has its challenges and tough points in the project, but usually you can tell those that are going to succeed versus the ones that fail based on what they're doing. And a lot of those decisions are made early in the transformation project. So that's probably the first big takeaway there is to understand that piece of it. The second thing is to start with a clear digital strategy. It's easy to rush into the software selection and or the implementation, but you want to make sure you have a clear vision for what it is you're trying to accomplish with the project. Are you doing this just as a technology upgrade? Per the earlier slide around digital transformation versus technology implementation. Where are you on that continuum? So have a clear long-term strategy and roadmap and understanding of what it is you're going to do to get to that long-term state of utopia that we were talking about earlier today. And again, if that state of utopia is something that's 10 years out or 5 years out or whatever it is, don't try to make that leap all at once. Too many organizations just try to make that leap because they've been sold a vision that could be allegedly be executed within 12 to 18 months or whatever the number is. But you need to be realistic about it and really understand incrementally how are we going to get there over the next however many years.
And in this space, you also want to, in defining your digital strategy and the goals that you're trying to get from this, knowing which ones which ones are more urgent and which ones require a little bit of building is important. The 2 examples I like to use in this space is don't know how many folks that are on green screen technology where it come to me with one of the first things that they ask for is advanced business analytics, advanced business intelligence. And you ask them, why do you want this? Like, well, I can't pull my finance reports out of this green screen system, so I need advanced technology to do this. What you need is financial reporting, not advanced BI yet. Like, let's see what it is comes out of the box as opposed to going straight to the most advanced stuff. Because advanced BI is, it's very cool. It does a lot of things and will enable you to make great decisions for your business. But without the right approach to it, you could overpay significantly for advanced business intelligence for just needing to close the books in less than 4 weeks, or just needing to be able to pull your financial statements without having to take 6 different sources, pull them into Excel and manipulate them. That's not advanced business intelligence. That's financial reporting. That's something that what we'd like to recommend is in that space, you replace what's there and what you need out of the box as close as possible, and then see if you need some of the more advanced technology, or did you actually get what you needed out of things once you know more about what it is you're biting off. The other part of this from a longer term perspective is things like MRP. I know Stuart was sharing the example with the Christmas trees, right? MRP is an intelligent process that's predictive, is based on demand planning, has a lot of inputs. And for something to be, for MRP to be predictive, it needs data. And your green screen data is going to be really hard for your MRP to really create a lot of value from. So if you're not running an MRP today, or it's not advanced, you may think about implementing that in a later phase as part of your digital strategy, so that you have time to get new, accurate, and very good data into your system. So then your MRP and demand planning modules can start making more predictive and effectively predictive recommendations for purchasing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of reminds me of the whole need to make sure you've got a clear understanding of what exactly you're getting. There's a lot of buzzwords floating around, but just making sure you translate that into what it's going to mean to your organization, how it's going to fit within your organization. And if it doesn't, then you have to ask yourself, well, why are we doing it? Just because they have this technology capability available to us doesn't mean we necessarily need to be deploying it, or at least not now. And speaking of that, that's a good segue into this next point, which is to let business drive the technology. The most successful projects that we've seen are the ones where it wasn't just IT leading the charge. It was more of a business focused initiative. Even if it was the CIO or IT director as the executive sponsor, or even if you did have a technical project manager internally, you still had some sort of strong business focus that treated IT more as an enabler of the business change, rather than assuming that IT was going to define for the business how the technology was going to fit within the business. So that's a really important point, because a lot of times we see a lot of businesses where the operational side will assume that the IT guy or gal is just going to take care of this, and the whole team on the IT side is going to take care of it, and just tell us what you need and we'll support you along the way. And really, it should be flipped around. It should be the business driving. This is what we need. This is how we want to define our processes. This is what we want to be when we grow up. Now let's figure out how technology is going to fit into that, rather than the other way around. And also, you want to make sure that the transformation is closely aligned with measurable goals and just overall objectives of the organization. We talk about organizational misalignment being a root cause of failure. A lot of times it's because the way we've defined a digital transformation isn't consistent with what we're trying to accomplish as a business. So I'll just give you an example. A lot of times we see cases where the executive or the strategic goal is to standardize business processes, to drive efficiency, and to move toward more of a shared service model where we're consolidating functions and we're starting to act like one common business with one common operating model across multiple locations. But then you get down to the digital transformation, and the path of least resistance oftentimes is to not do that, because that's painful to do those things. And so let's just sort of pave the cow paths and put technology in place in a way that's going to just enable the way we've always done things or the way we're doing things now. And not to open a whole nother can of worms or Pandora's box here, that we could probably create a whole session on this one comment or this one thread. But I think the whole agile movement has actually made this problem worse, because now now in the name of agile, we're just going to go start doing stuff. And I know I'm oversimplifying. I'm probably offending a certain number of people in the audience today, but that's not the intent. The intent here is to look more strategically at, yes, we can go execute from an agile perspective, but when it comes to defining and planning what we want to be when we grow up and what our processes should look like, that just takes time. And agile runs counter to that. Agile says, don't spend a lot of time up front doing that. Just go build stuff and get a minimum viable product. And let's just start making some progress and getting some quick wins. Well, okay, we can get a lot of quick wins along the way, but we could be going in the totally wrong direction, getting quick wins along the way. So we've got to make sure we're going the right direction, and we have that alignment with the overall strategy. So just some food for thought as you think about how are we going to treat this project? How are we going to plan for it? What's our strategy? How are we going to put together the plan? All that good stuff. The other another thread here is to set realistic expectations. I mentioned before in the last session or the first session from today that unrealistic expectations are often the root causes of problems later on. And again, the phenomena we see, or the dynamic we see in place there, is that you box in your project with some unrealistic assumptions. You assume it's going to take less time, money, and resources, and you assume it's going to be less risky than it really is going to be. And then you get into the implementation after everyone's on board with those assumptions. You get into the project or halfway through the project and realize that this isn't going to work. This was never realistic to begin with, and now we need more time and money, or we have to dramatically cut scope or cut corners just to be able to fit within this, flawed budget and timeline. So that's the big thing that we've got to keep in mind, is that you want to have those realistic expectations. And the biggest word of advice I can give is that last bullet there, which is when you get proposals from vendors, you don't want to distrust them, but you also want to ask a lot of questions, like how in the world are we going to migrate all of our data in a week, or whatever the assumption might be in their plan or in their proposal. And also look for things that aren't in their proposal that are important to the success of the project and should be built into your overall plan. So if you think of it as an overall program plan that you're managing, the technical implementer, the system integrator, or the vendor is just one part of that. So to put all your eggs in that one basket, to say whatever proposal they give me, that's what I'm going to budget on, that's flawed from the start, even if they're not being overly optimistic, because they haven't included all the other things that you're responsible for. So you're probably going to be responsible for data migration. You're probably going to be responsible for change management. You're probably going to be responsible for defining your business processes, for integrating to third-party systems. These are all things that are super critical to the project, but they typically don't build that into their plans, or if they have, it's very superficial, very tertiary at best. And add to that the fact that usually they're overly optimistic on their own work stream, and you can see how quickly you're going to end up with an unrealistic set of expectations if you don't ask the tough questions, and if you don't have the people, unbiased, agnostic people helping you that can help identify where those gaps are and where the dose of reality needs to be added.
And to elaborate on that a bit more, I think that from a vendor perspective, and there's a lot of conversations that we have on this that we should give them some credit. They know what their system can do, and there's a confirmation bias in that. They've seen their system do all kinds of things. They know it can do just about anything, but that doesn't mean that they know that it can do it well or better than anybody else's, or without the significant degree of customization, or that just because they think it can happen doesn't always mean that it can in that system in that way either. So that confirmation bias is really part of what causes a lot of those problems, in my opinion. And from a perspective of the taking things with a grain of salt and setting realistic expectations, for Rajan's question on artificial intelligence in ERP versus built-in products or other tools like Power BI, what are your expectations? You know, the answer to which is better is what's the better fit for you. You know, if your expectations are that it is going to do quite a lot of AI based number crunching and decision making for you, then Power BI is not going to be able to handle that. But if it's something that is more aligned towards the business and the intelligence skill sets, key performance indicators, you know, maybe a smaller software package is realistic. You know, so think about your needs and how it is your expectations are set and what it is you're looking for software to do to meet those needs.
Yeah, really, really good points. And yeah, couldn't agree more with you. I also like Richard's comment here. I think I mentioned something about a grain of salt, and he said grain, question mark, or big pile. And that is a way to look at it. I know you might be half kidding on that comment, but you do have to, you know, you do have to accept it for what it is when you get these proposals and these proposed budgets and timelines. Is they're trying to make a sale, and you know that's just human nature. Even if you assume the best in people, you have to assume that the human nature is they want to make the sale, and they're not gonna risk alarming you as a potential customer. All right, we're going to take a quick break and pick this up when we come back. But first, let's take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Relax, don't do it when you want to go to it. Relax, don't do it when you want to come. Relax.
Hello, and welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Kyler Cheatham, and we're in the middle of a presentation clip that we're playing from Adam Cheatham and myself. So let's go ahead and jump back into the conversation. So another point here is that implementation is more important than selection. That's one of the big findings we see with clients. It's easy to get overwhelmed with all the options out there. It's easy to get caught up in analysis paralysis. We see it all the time, especially when you get more stakeholders involved. And, you know, on one hand, from a change management and buy-in perspective, you want people to be involved in the decision and the evaluation process. But on the other hand, that complicates things. That can slow down the decision-making process because you're never going to get all of your questions answered. You're never going to feel 100% comfortable with whatever solution or solutions you end up wanting to go with. And so you really have to find that balance between, yeah, we want buy-in, we want to do our due diligence, but we also don't want to spend way too much time and money thinking through this stuff. Because what ends up happening a lot of times is that, again, the analysis paralysis sets in and you reach a point of diminishing returns where you're never going to be fully confident and comfortable. And now we're just wasting time and money that we could be spending on the actual implementation. So if we view resources as being finite, which it is for most organizations, you really have to think about, okay, every day and week and month that we go on without a decision, or that we spend trying to overanalyze, overthink a process, or worse yet, evaluate systems that we shouldn't have been evaluating in the first place because it's just not a good fit. It doesn't, you know, there's key requirements that we have that isn't going to be met by this technology. So why are we spending our time evaluating it? That ends up happening a lot too. So the quicker you can get through an educated and agnostic and informed evaluation and get to a decision and then start to really focus and double down on the implementation itself, that's going to serve you a lot better. If you can have a really strong implementation on a subpar software, that's going to be a much better bet than having 100% confidence that you found the perfect technology, but then now you don't have enough time and money to implement it appropriately.
And on that, I would say that your selection, if as long as your selection is enabling your implementation on the whole, where you're really starting to think future state and prepare for your implementation and treat it almost like an extension of your readiness phase, that's really the best way to use a software selection, so that you're really getting a lot out of what it is you're doing to select the system, but it's not just focused on the sheer purpose of determining whether or not you should go with one versus another, but is also gaining some additional value in the way that you'll be more ready to start. People will be engaged. Your processes can be a bit more well defined. If you're really going to go big in the selection phase, it is more important to implement well than select well, but you should also consider that you can really get some great synergy on your readiness activities in using your selection phase to be a double-edged tool for you.
Yeah, that's a great point. You don't have to necessarily wait until you get through the selection to then think about change management or then think about a rollout strategy and all that stuff.
Well, so many of the change management tactics, data, process improvements, you don't need software for those. You can evaluate that and get that in place, and it will make your implementation go far more smoothly, and you'll start reaping benefits earlier as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You knock out some of those critical path activities sooner. I think we've hit this point several times throughout multiple presentations today, so I won't spend a lot of time here, but there's no silver bullets. Watch out for the silver bullets. Be leery of it. Be skeptical. Sometimes I feel like that old Saturday Night Live skit with Debbie Downer, where she, someone will be talking about how they had a great time at Disneyland or whatever, and then she steps in and starts complaining about the risk of going on amusement park rides and stuff like that. If you haven't seen the skit, that's the gist of Debbie Downer. And they do it in a lighthearted way, but you kind of have to act like Debbie Downer when it comes to the over optimism that comes at you from the software vendors and system integrators. And that, healthy dose of skepticism will serve you well, just to, not assume that just because the technology is great, that it's going to be easy. Probably the best example is cloud deployments. I mean, I think that's one of the most oversold movements in the industry, even though the whole industry, as we talked about before, is moving to the cloud. And I'm not disputing the benefit of the cloud, but what I am disputing is this whole notion that cloud deployments are somehow easier, they're cheaper, they're faster, because they're just simply not. If anything, the way cloud deployments have been going recently with some of these relatively immature cloud solutions being rolled out to organizations by really big software vendors, it's actually complicating things more to where, I would argue it could potentially be increasing time and cost for transformation. So, really watch out for that silver bullet mentality, which is, it's what we all want to hear, so it's understandable. I want to hear that there's an easy button out there. I want to hear that a cloud solution is super easy to deploy. I want to hear that my people aren't going to resist this change and that they're just going to love this technology. That's all stuff I want to hear. But what I want to hear versus reality are oftentimes very different when it comes to these transformations. And probably the most important thing is that, even if you assume the technology itself is easier to deploy for whatever reason, we still haven't addressed the really big problem, which is the people and process side of the equation. Those are always the toughest parts, I should say.
Sometimes faster is not better on that. There you go. So actually, you can go to the next one.
Yeah.
Thank you. I won't steal too much of your thunder on this, but sometimes faster is more expensive. And you rush into creating more problems than solving them by moving more quickly. So I'll back off for a second here for you to get to the slide, Eric.
No, that's perfect. You're more than welcome to steal my thunder anytime. Yeah. I think you hit the point here that it's you don't. I think there's a fine line here between going fast and being aggressive in your implementation or in your overall project. You can do that if you have a solid plan and you're aligned and you've got clear direction. The problem is too often you run into this dynamic where we've selected the software, we've signed the contract, the vendors and the system integrators are pressuring us now to bring on the army of people to help them start deploying, to help you start deploying the technology. And add that to the fact that there's a lot of excitement internally around this decision. Usually momentum's the highest right at the end of the selection phase, right? When you've decided that this is a path forward, that's about as high as momentum's going to ever be in a project. And that's about as high as morale is going to be on your project team. And I hate to say it, but that's typically true. And then from then, then it starts to drop once you start to get it into the headwinds and into the weeds of the what the change actually means and all the nuances that go in with it. So that dynamic oftentimes leads organizations, because they've got so much momentum. People are excited about this new path forward. Vendor and system integrator are pressuring you to get started right away. It leads to this phenomena where we end up bringing in a ton of consultants that are there ready to start building stuff, but we're still trying to figure out, what are we doing here? What are our processes going to be? What are we consolidating? What are we standardizing? What are we not? And while you're making those decisions, the meter's running. You're paying for that time for the consultants to be sitting there waiting for you to decide. So you really want to take a couple steps back to take many steps forward and to be able to move faster later by getting that clear definition of plan in place. To your point, Adam, faster isn't always better, but sometimes you have to start off slow to be able to go faster later. And overall, that can be the faster and cheaper approach.
When it takes time for the system integrator to get their team on board too, right? So one of the biggest challenges is that sales handoff. The folks that you've been talking to most of the time, you might have one or two technical resources that you've been talking to, but you've been talking to the sales guys the whole time, and that handoff takes time. And there's an embedded assumption that because I told the sales guy, everybody at the organization knows what I told them is my most important thing. And it takes time for that message to sink in across your implementation team, your system integrators, and for them to get up and running so that your technical resources understand your business, that there's that knowledge handoff, and trying to rush that part of the implementation from a planning perspective can really start putting people in spots where they're expected to know more than they should yet.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. And then finally, as a preview of the next session, the most important thing is organizational change management, the people side of the equation. Your project will fail without it. I don't think I've ever seen a project succeed that didn't invest really heavily in change management. And even the cases that I've been involved with or that we've been involved with as a team, where they have invested heavily in change management, there's typically more you could be doing to be doing a better job in that area. And it really comes down to understanding what exactly change management is. And that, again, that's the topic for the next discussion. I just realized, Kyler, we're way over on time, so I apologize. We're throwing off your schedule here. But just at a high level, I think the one thing I'd say, short of getting into the details that we'll cover in the next session, is that change management is a lot more than just training and communications. If your system integrator, your vendor is probably going to suggest a certain amount of communication and training type of activities, which is great, but that is just scratching the surface, and that's stuff that's way downstream. You need to be doing change management from day one, and that includes things like organizational design, the organizational readiness, the change impact analysis, and really targeting the communications along the way, not just what are we doing with this project, and not just when are we going to get trained on the new system. That stuff's important, but what's more important is how is this project going to affect me and my job, and how is it compared to the way I do things today, and how are you going to help me understand that and get to that point? What ends up happening too often is that you get to the training workshops, in class training or whatever it is, and people have their freak out moments in the training. They should be having those freak out moments way earlier in the process so you can work through it and work through those kinks so that by the time you get to end user training, it's more of a formality of, okay, I already understand that my job's changing and I understand why, and I've already freaked out. Now you're just going to show me how to do it in the new system. So I'm oversimplifying, but that's sort of the general dynamic that we often see with change management. So make sure you have a real solid investment in change management. All right. So we're going to unpack some of that stuff we just talked about here that Adam and I talked about as it relates to executive strategy and digital strategy. But first, we'll take a quick break and we'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control. So for all you listeners of Transformation Ground Control, I wanted to remind you of a premier annual event that we host every year. It's called Digital Stratosphere. It's a virtual conference that we've actually shifted to virtual since the pandemic. And we're having our next Digital Stratosphere conference online virtually February 8th through the 10th. So I encourage you to register for that. Myself and others from the Third Stage team will be hosting sessions, facilitating sessions about software selection, how to implement software, what some of the best practices are, change management, digital strategy, program management, all the stuff you need to know to make your digital transformation successful in 2022 and beyond. This event's for you. Registration's free. We encourage you and your teams to join. If you're not able to join us live, which we hope you will, but if you can't join us live, we'll also we'll make the recordings available to you. So be sure to register either way. Even if you can't join all of the sessions live, you'll at least get access to the library of recordings. So I encourage you to check that out. There's a link below in this podcast, wherever you're listening or watching. There's a link below to register. And you can also just go to our website at Third Stage, and it's spelled THIRD, stage-consulting.com. At the top of the page, you'll see an icon for registering for Digital Stratosphere. So be sure to check it out. Digital Stratosphere, February 8th through 10th. Hope to see you there. Hello and welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 53. We just had Adam Cheatham and myself, a clip that we played of he and I presenting at Stratosphere 2021. And again, just as a quick reminder, you can register for Stratosphere 2022, which is February 8th through the 10th. You can go to stratosphere2022.com to see the agenda and register. There's no cost. It's a virtual event. It's live. You'll get the recordings. So a lot of good reasons to check it out. It's 3 full days of content as well. Kyler and I will be there. Adam will be there. Marcus, who was on the show earlier today, will be there, as well as several other speakers as well. So be sure to check that out at stratosphere2022.com. But in the meantime, what were some of your takeaways from that presentation? I know you've seen it before. This isn't the first time you've seen it or heard it, but what were some of your takeaways from that?
Yeah, so I'm curious as to, is this, when you put together kind of the executive summary, or when you start with specifically one of the first steps is strategic alignment, and you go in and you have kind of that boot camp format, that conversation with the executives to secure that alignment, does the alignment ever slip? Or how do you make sure that you're constantly holding that alignment in place when you're, say, 6 weeks into the project and we kind of forgot, what our overall goals are? We may have them documented. We may have had a great whiteboard session about what they are, but how do you make sure you're still kind of attaching your work to the overall strategic alignment that you secured within kind of these first steps?
Well, there's a couple of different ways. First of all, through the sort of general project governance of having a regular cadence of executive steering committee and executive touch points, whether it be formal project readouts and discussion about risk and how we're tracking and with budget and time and where the risks are, what our risk mitigation strategy is, how we're doing with resourcing, all that stuff, so that not only so the executives are aware, but also so that you can stay aligned with the executives. That's one way. The other way that's, I think, even more powerful than the sort of the project governance, project status based approach to keeping executives involved or up to speed with what's going on with the project is the decision framework that you have in place as part of your overall project governance. So in other words, you want to make sure you look at your digital transformation and make sure you have key milestones and checkpoints with the executive team to where they have to sort of bless the next step. They have to approve a certain deliverable, or they have to decide whether or not it's time to go to the next step and sort of put the ownership on them. Certainly as a project team, as outside consultants, you're going to make your recommendations of what you think, but ultimately they need to be the ones to decide on what those next steps are. And also by making them part of the decision process, that's a good collaborative way to make sure that, for example, if we finish the design phase of the project and we've defined all of our detailed business processes and workflows, we should be having the executive team sort of sign off on those processes and make sure that's consistent with their vision of what they want the future state to look like. Because this is not just a technology deployment, or shouldn't just be a technology deployment, we need to make sure that the executives are actively involved in that. So those are the two best ways I can think of to do that.
Yeah, definitely. So it sounds like there's multiple places within the project that you almost use them as a approval resource. Like you already kind of know that that's right because you've worked with the specific teams and departments and understand that's the best choice. But to keep them engaged, you continue to just involve them in kind of every piece of the overall project.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also mitigates that risk of the executives that might view this as something they should just delegate or abdicate to other team members. I mean, you really have to push your executive team to roll up their sleeves and be a part of the project. They don't need to be involved, obviously in day-to-day testing of software and, configuration and definition of requirements and stuff like that, but they should be involved at key milestones and touch points so that they're part of the process and they can redirect and help pivot where needed.
Absolutely. And backing up to that kind of establishment of the business processes, when you talk about obviously software evaluation and we look at business intelligence, all of those things kind of wrapped up together, they involve workshops, right? Like you touched on a lot of times. And so we saw a lot of businesses at our April 2021 event that were kind of holding on doing those digital transformation exercises because of the COVID-19 pandemic, in hopes like, hey, we want to do this in person with our consultants because it's the only way we know how to explain them our business processes and get their information. But there's a lot of other businesses that are really, risk adverse to that. They don't want to have that disruption. So I wonder if you could give us some insight as to how you and the team have still facilitated those and make sure that you're moving forward with digital transformation projects in kind of a hybrid environment. How do you evaluate that, and how do you work with your clients and teams on that?
Well, it's certainly harder to do more of that ad hoc collaboration that you might see during a typical digital transformation in a non-pandemic time. So, for example, pre-pandemic, most clients would have a project war room set up where they'd have a bunch of workspaces in one room where the project team's working. They can do testing together. They can work on training materials together. And it's sort of that real-time collaboration. That's harder to do remotely if you do have people that are remote, or even if it's not because of the pandemic and it's because you're a global company and you've got teams dispersed throughout the world, you have to figure this out as well. So it is a challenge I don't think really goes away with the pandemic, but it becomes less common with the pandemic for sure. But you just have to make sure, the project management, the day-to-day project management becomes that much more important because you have to schedule meetings. You have to schedule those collaborative times that might have just more organically happened in your war room in the past. We have some clients where they'll set up sort of a Microsoft Teams or a Zoom-based war room of sorts where it's just open. They're in there collaborating. They're doing their thing. And that can be effective as well. But I would say, I would challenge, and I typically do challenge digital transformation teams to really think about, where are the selective points where you can have those in-person touch points, obviously being safe or following whatever protocols your company or your country regulations might impose on you. You want to make sure you have those touch points at some point, because I think those in-person human interactions are critical. And I don't think that necessarily goes away just because we have technology to do meetings now.
Yeah, and not at all that I'm holding a grudge, but my husband, who's on, the executive team here at Third Stage, had to go to Aruba to quarantine for 5 days, and that was really, really rough for him. So,
Is he okay?
Yeah, I know. He would, sent me a picture on a fishing boat. Oh no,
He was super sad, huh?
Well,
he seemed.
But I will.
I just talked to him earlier today. He seems okay now.
Oh, good. Thank goodness. Yeah. No. But in all seriousness, it sounds like Third Stage has kind of taken that need evaluation for clients. Like, really, what do you need as a business? And you've evolved to be able to present workshops in person, to present deliverables in person, or in a hybrid environment, or in a full-on digital virtual environment, if that's what is best for the client.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you kind of have to do what fits your culture and what your MO or your sort of day-to-day procedures are.
Absolutely. And kind of building on that, we talked a little bit about this with Marcus, and we talked a lot about this at Stratosphere 2021. We had a whole panel on managing a remote workforce. So when we talk about the need for things like organizational change management, which was also a main tactic within this conversation, and we haven't said it all episode, so we're nearing the end, so it's crunch time.
Right.
But how do you go about creating a plan? Because it used to be kind of it needed to attach to the business, right? The organizational change management through assessments. Is it different when you now have to kind of understand and almost consume what the culture is in a remote environment? Yeah,
it's a great point. I was actually thinking of that when you were talking about the remote project teams. That is the part that's hardest, especially to consultants who are trying to help facilitate a transformation that aligns with an organization's culture, both who they are today and where they want that culture to go in the future. It's really hard to do over Zoom. You can pick it up on Zoom or over Microsoft Teams, but it's being there in person and getting a look and feel for an organization is super critical, in my opinion.
Absolutely. So are you planning on going about producing an additional kind of version of your executive summary within your kind of kickoff on day one about digital transformation in the 2020s?
I feel like that's not a question. I feel like you're sort of telling me maybe I should do that. So I guess the answer is yes.
Jedi mind trick type of thing.
Exactly. So you're saying I should change it?
No, I just wonder, I think for me, this was such a great actionable presentation that gave us like literal tactics that you walked us through on the slide. And I wondered if, knowing the agenda and the speakers for our 2022 event, if you could kind of give our audience some insight and in some talks that might be a good one to attend, if that's really what you're looking for.
Yeah, so I think certainly the executive summary of trends in the 2020s is a good one. That's the keynote that I do on the first day. There's certainly the sessions around change management, I think, are particularly good, and those are important ones to cover. Marcus Harris, his overview of some of the legal aspects of transformation is very good. Also, you mentioned Brad Feeks earlier, Estes Group. Brad Feeks is the president of Estes Group. He's been on this podcast a couple times in the past. He'll be a keynote speaker at Stratosphere, and he'll talk about sort of cloud cybersecurity managed services. So that is a good one too, especially as more organizations are making that transition to the cloud and to away from on-prem and physical infrastructure internally, to more of an outsourced model. So those are just a few that come to mind. In my opinion, I think they're all good. I'm very biased. I'll be completely candid because you and I create the agenda. So we've got our fingerprints all over, and that's what we think are the best sessions, and that's why we picked them. So I am going to be biased, but those are some of the ones that sort of stand out as really important ones.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could just add to that list, we could just mention all of them on here. But we do have a business intelligence panel, which is very interesting because our panelists are Brian Laparuba, who is, a manager here at Third Stage and has been at Third Stage. I think he is the longest standing, consultant on our team. And he's very matter of fact to the point. And purposely, I coupled him with Teresa Richardson, who we heard from our live stream, who will take us through business processes. And she is very kind of holistic and focused on organizational change management. So if you want some specific tactics on how do you attach the very analytical to more of the human behavior side, that will be a very, very interesting panel. And then another new session we have this time is establishing your target operating model. And they actually go through process in making sure that you're establishing the right steps and it's being most effective. So those are two, if you're really looking for those tactical best practices to pull out, those are our two delivery teams that actually do that day to day. So just some additional ones there. But thank you for, kind of giving us the relevancy of this topic, as it is still very extremely relevant today, even in our world of uncertainty, and taking us through that. And I'm excited to hear kind of your revitalization version of it. Revitalization, is that a word? Revitalization.
It's like strategery. It's not really a word, but you kind of know what it means.
But it should be. No.
Yeah, it should be a word, right?
Right. For Stratosphere, and just a reminder that it's happening on February 8th through the 10th of 2022. It's the 3-day event, fully free this year. And we have a packed full agenda. If you want to head over to stratosphere2022.com to view our agenda and go ahead and secure your spot and register. If you do register, the sooner the better, so you can get all of the pre-event communication and some very exclusive content from our sponsors as well.
Great. Yeah, and since you've assigned me the task of revitalizing my presentation for this event, we better wrap up this podcast so I can get to work.
Yeah, we better. You got to get to work, man.
I know there's not a lot of time until I'm here in a few days. So, well, good. Well, thanks for being here again. As always, Kyler, thanks for the great conversation. Thanks to the audience for being part of this podcast. And again, you mentioned it earlier in the show, but every Tuesday at 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern time, we do a live stream of one of the interviews that you hear in this podcast, and then we sort of repurpose it and package it into this full podcast episode. But if you ever want to be part of that live audience and that live stream, join us on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter every Tuesday, 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern time, if that time works for you, depending on where in the world you are. So, and if not, you'll always pick it up here when we put out the new episodes of this podcast. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. Hope you have a great week. We'll see you next week on Transformation Ground Control, and hope you have a great day and a great week in the meantime. Take care.